Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if neglected Naruto breaks female Sasuke council bashing. Before I start, please support for more amazing content and do consider subscribing to my channel and share this video with your friends. This is written by dasonone and link in the description and support writer. Let's start the video. The Archangel Chapter 1. Light for a Cursed Boy. A blonde boy with whisker-like mark sat under a tree with a massive scroll in his hands. His face continued to change between happiness and anger at what he was reading from the scroll. Why, you ask? The answer was quite simple, he was looking over the forbidden scroll to try and learn some techniques. Why was he doing that? He had failed the genin exam for the third time, and just when he thought that there was no hope for him to ever make it as a ninja, one of his sensei approached him and told him of this place and the scroll, promising to pass him if he learns a jutsu from the scroll. The blonde scratched his head, he had already learned the Kage Bunshin, despite the fact that Bunshin no Jutsu was his weakest skill. Somehow, he managed to learn the Kage Bunshin, and he could actually create a solid clone. Once he completed the task he should have just stayed and waited for his sensei to arrive, but as they say, curiosity killed the cat, for you see he wanted to learn more, his taste for learning techniques couldn't be saturated by just one, he wanted more, and the scroll could give him what he desired. So he did the next best thing to saturate his thirst for jutsus, he continued to read the scroll, skipping over a lot of jutsus that in his opinion weren't good at all. As he was passing through the list of jutsus, something crossed his mind. What if the weakest of the jutsus was the first one on the list, and what if the strongest was at the bottom of the list? The blonde grinned to himself as he started unrolling the entire scroll, trying to reach the very end. His eyes widened at the sheer size of the scroll, it was bigger than it looked when it was rolled. The scroll, if he was right, was about 9 to 10 meters long. Jutsus from the time Konoha was founded were present on this large piece of paper. Jutsus used by the very first Hokage were also written on the scroll. He would have learned them, he was tempted, but he wanted to see the very first jutsu, the first two to be more exact. So he continued to unroll the scroll until he reached the end, and what greeted him was something he couldn't understand nor comprehend. The last two jutsus, dating back from the moment Konoha was being built, were in a different language. He tried to understand it, but he couldn't. It was alien to him, the description was even stranger, it had writing, yes, but it was in a language he couldn't comprehend no matter how much he tried to. So Naruto looked at the picture description, it showed a human doing the hand seals that he had never seen before in his life, and he had never read about them in books or so on. But anyway, Naruto continued to look as the man was entangled in a bright light from what it seemed, and then it ended. The blonde groaned when he saw that the rest of the image was erased, cut out. The boy growled in annoyance, deciding to look at the one before the first, he saw the same strange writing. He sighed. Naruto looked at the picture description wondering if it will help, all it showed was a strange man holding a sword. What was strange about the man was that he had wings like he were some kind of bird or something like that. The blonde raised an eyebrow and started thinking, maybe this jutsu will give the user wings so he can fly, and maybe that sword as well. He grinned thinking of the possibilities with such a technique. Still, the other one was on his mind and he kept thinking, why not try and see what it does? So he did just that. The blonde sat cross-legged on the ground and started exercising the strange hand seals. Naruto realized something was strange, as he kept working on the hand seals he thought that he could understand the title of the jutsus, or at least that he could read them, but it still didn't ring a bell as to what they would really do, especially the first one. But he shrugged as he continued to work on the jutsu, there would be no harm in it after all if he tried them, right? They couldn't actually kill him. Unknown to him, as he was practicing, many people felt his attempt, various warriors only seen or heard of in legends, rose to see what was happening, an odd power surge could be felt traveling through their plane. Naruto didn't know at the moment, but with his practice and his tries, he was stirring up ancient forces, foes, and with them he was starting a battle that had been long forgotten. Naruto stood panting on the ground with the scroll rolled, he had finished training, and he was beat. It proved tougher than he originally thought, it wasn't a stroll in the park, but then again, was life ever a stroll in the park? The blonde shook his head while chuckling silently to himself, it was a little hard seeing how tired he was. Just then someone dropped from the trees in front of Naruto, he recognized the person instantly, it was none other than Iruka, and he looked really pissed off. "An Naruto?" he said with a menacing voice. It looked like he was about to explode because of the anger at any moment. "Ah, you found me, Iruka-sensei," said Naruto, rubbing the back of his head sheepishly. "Iruka-sensei, I learned a jutsu from the scroll, now you will have to pass me, right?" he asked, smiling with sparkles in his eyes. After all, that was what Mizuki told him, and surely Mizuki wouldn't lie. "Pass you?" he asked, intrigued, his rage long forgotten. "Who gave you that idea?" "Mizuki-sensei said," responded Naruto with a grin on his face. "He told me that if I learn a jutsu from this scroll you will have to pass me." Haruka's eyes widened, understanding what was happening here. The boy was tricked into stealing the scroll. Just then Haruka felt another presence. "Ah, so Haruka made it before me, no matter, hand over the scroll Naruto," demanded Mizuki, who was sitting in a tree, on a branch to be more precise. "No Naruto, don't give him the scroll," yelled Haruka, looking back at the blonde from Mizuki. Mizuki frowned and took a giant shuriken from his back and launched it towards Naruto, who stood in fear. He closed his eyes, waiting for the pain to come. He heard the shuriken slash something, but the pain didn't come. He opened his eyes and saw Haruka had shielded him. "Why?" asked Naruto, tearing up. "Bekase know how it's Luketo be alone," said Haruka, cringing in pain. "Oh, isn't this touching?" mocked Mizuki. "Hand me the scroll, boy," demanded the man while moving his hand towards the second Fuma shuriken. "No Naruto. Whatever you do, don't give it to him," said Haruka as he looked at the blonde pleadingly. "Do you want to know why everyone hates you?" asked Mizuki with a sick grin on his face. "No Mizuki, don't," yelled in despair Haruka. "It's because of a decree that the Hokage put, not letting us tell anyone the truth about the Kyuubi incident," he said, ignoring Haruka. "Don't Mizuki?" "The decree?" asked Naruto, scared and confused at the same time. "Yes, a decree that you don't know because it's about you. It's to not let you know that you are actually the Kyuubi no Kitsune. Yondaime could not defeat the fox, so he sealed it into you. You are Kyuubi no Kitsune, that's why everyone hates you and shuns you, even your precious Haruka," said Mizuki, starting to laugh hysterical. Naruto looked at Haruka with fear in his eyes. He was Kyuubi, he had the Kyuubi inside of him, which is why everyone hates him, the reason why everyone shuns him. He rolled away from Haruka and started running into the forest. "Naruto!" yelled Haruka. "Get back here, demon," said Mizuki, running after Naruto. Haruka got back on his feet and ran after them. A few minutes later Haruka caught up with Naruto. "Naruto, listen to me," said Haruka, "give me the scroll before Mizuki comes." Naruto jumped on Haruka, kicking him and throwing him on the ground. He landed in front of him. "How did you know?" asked Haruka, poofing. Instead of Haruka there was now Mizuki. "That's because Naruto poofed as well. I am the real Haruka," the Chunin said. "Why do you protect him?" demanded Mizuki. Unknown to them, Naruto was listening behind a tree. "I thought you hated the demon." "It's true, I hate the demon," said Haruka, and Naruto felt his heart break. He felt rejected again, but not Naruto. At this Naruto felt his heart stop as his head snapped up. "I hate the demon fox Kyuubi, but not Naruto, who is a totally different entity. He is Uzumaki Naruto, Konoha's #1 most unpredictable ninja and prankster." "Touching," said Mizuki, taking the second shuriken. He threw it at Haruka, who had his back to a tree, too tired and injured to move out of the way. Just as the shuriken was about to hit Haruka, a blur passed in front of the Chunin, and Naruto caught the weapon with his right hand. "Don't you ever hurt Haruka-sensei," he said coldly as his eyes started glowing. "And what are you going to do, brat?" laughed Mizuki. "I'm going to kick your ass," yelled Naruto. "Oh yeah? I will only need one shot to finish you off." Naruto smirked and made a hand seal. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu, the area filled with at least 100 Narutos. Mizuki's and Haruka's eyes went wide at the jutsu. "So?" asked the clones. "I thought you were going to beat me in one go." They taunted, "If you won't do it then I will." They jumped on him and started fighting. But something went wrong. Mizuki had changed during the fight in a strange half-human creature. He looked like a mix between a panther and a human. He became more powerful and managed to defeat all the clones. The blonde was now on the ground, panting and looking at the man with fear in his eyes. He was too tired, the clones were ineffective, and he could hear Mizuki laughing at him. "That was all you got, demon?" spat the man as he looked at the blonde. "I thought you were better for it, demon," he taunted. Rage started building up in Naruto. He grabbed the scroll and let it drop on the ground as he stood up. "Don't think this is over," he growled as he brought his hands up in a seal. "Oh, you will try your luck again?" taunted Mizuki as Naruto growled. "No, I got something better," smirked the blonde as he started doing hand signs. Mizuki and Haruka looked at what the boy was doing, trying to understand. They had never seen those hand signs before. The blonde suddenly said something that both men couldn't understand, and soon his right hand started glowing white. He smirked and made another set of hand signs, this time for the last jutsu in the scroll. Once more he said something in the same strange language, but this time nothing happened. The blonde looked with wide eyes, nothing was happening. Was that jutsu a joke? Was he out of chakra? He could hear Mizuki roaring with laughter at him. He growled. He decided to use the Kage Bunshin once more. Just as he was about to use the technique again, he felt pain in his back, in his shoulder blades to be more exact. He dropped on his knees, holding his head and screaming. The two Chunin watched as something seemed to boil in the blonde boy's back. The sound of clothing ripping could be heard as two large wings burst from the blonde's body, spraying blood on the ground and making the blonde shout in pain. Haruka and Mizuki looked in awe at the large angel-like wings. They were big, it seemed to be bigger than the boy by at least 3 inches. The blonde dropped on the ground as the wings dropped on the ground on him. Mizuki shook his head and sneered, a demon was still a demon, and this was one of his trickeries. He took a kunai out and started walking towards Naruto. "No, don't do it, Mizuki." Haruka yelled in fear. The Chunin grinned as he stood in front of the blonde with his kunai up and ready to strike. He started lowering the weapon, and just as it was about to hit the boy's head, a hand shot up and grabbed Mizuki's. The white-haired man looked in horror as the hand belonged to the blonde boy, only that the hand was inside a gauntlet, a pure white gauntlet. If things couldn't get any weirder, the blonde's head snapped up to look at Mizuki, but what was strange was the fact that his eyes were wide and glowing. A strange white light entangled the blonde as his clothes started changing. The light made its way down from the blonde's feet to his head, creating a white robe and hood. All Mizuki could see now was one of the blonde's eyes as his face was now completely covered by the hood. The blonde twisted Mizuki's hands, making him gasp in pain, and then with a flick of his wrist the boy threw Mizuki away into a nearby tree. Slowly the boy stood up and Haruka could clearly see a sword in the blonde's right hand, the sword's hilt resembled angel wings. Well, the blade was thick at the start and as it kept going it became thinner. The design of 9 tails could be seen on the sword. Once again the blonde was entangled in light and this time fire. Slowly, designs started appearing on the blonde. On the back of the robe the design of an angel and a fox facing each other could be seen. His left gauntlet had fiery red designs of fox tails on it, while the right gauntlet remained pure white. His wings shot up as strange sparkles dropped from the wings. The blonde turned his head slowly towards Mizuki who was now looking in fear at the blonde. Slowly, the boy raised his left hand up, it caught fire. He pointed towards Mizuki and the unthinkable happened. The man caught fire, just like that, he caught fire. He started screaming and started dropping and rolling to extinguish the flames, but it wouldn't die down. In a matter of seconds Mizuki burned his corpse unrecognizable. The blonde then turned towards Haruka, the man couldn't see his face, and the hood was now covering his entire face, apart from his mouth of course. He had no emotions judging by the thin line that his mouth made. The blonde started walking towards Haruka, the Chunin didn't know what was going to happen, was Naruto going to kill him as well? He started shaking in fear, just as Naruto reached the man he dropped on his knees and then flat on his face, his wings dropping on his body once more. He felt warm, it was like that one time when he fell asleep on the field in midsummer and the sun bathed him with its warmness. That feeling of having the sunshine on your face, it was just like that. A small smile appeared on his face as he snuggled deeper in the soft grass. His mind was now making him believe he was in that grassy field once more, near that tree he always used to hide in from people that he angered. His ears then registered movement, someone shifted in their location and gave a light cough, almost unheard. Then he felt something on his body, it felt soft, it felt warm. Then his nose picked up that smell which he hated with a passion, the smell of antiseptics and the unforgettable stench from a hospital. His eyes snapped open as he found himself staring at a ceiling. He looked down and saw the covers. Then he looked around and nodded to himself, he was in a hospital. Slowly, the blonde tried to sit up. "You shouldn't move, Uzumaki-san." An Anbu said in a distinctive feminine voice as she suddenly appeared in the room. "Hokage-sama said that you aren't supposed to move until he returns," she told the blonde. "Why is that?" asked Naruto. He felt his back aching. Groaning, he moved his hand behind only to feel feathers. He blinked in surprise as he turned his head slightly behind and saw the wings, his eyes widened and then looked downcast. "So it wasn't a dream," he muttered. "Pardon me?" asked the woman, tilting her head slightly to the side in confusion. "I really did kill Mizuki. I'm a demon," he said, looking down at his trembling hands. The woman placed her hand on his head, making him look at her. "Whatever people say, you aren't a demon and it's a ninja's job to kill and feel bad," she said, smiling behind her mask, though Naruto couldn't see. "Thanks," the blonde replied with a small grin. "I guess you're right," he said and then sighed once more. "Is something the matter, Uzumaki-san?" she asked, taking her hand away. "No, it's fine," he replied tiredly. "It's not," said the woman, making Naruto look at her. "I can see that something is bothering you, don't be afraid, you can tell me," she said kindly. The blonde looked at her skeptical and then sighed. "I don't know what I will do now," he said. "Why is that?" she asked curiously. "I failed my exam again, all the others Pasetti will be stuck in the academy still," he said in a sad voice at first and then with anger. The woman shook her head as she looked down at the blonde. "Don't worry, the Hokage has a surprise for you," she said with a giggle. Just then the door opened, the woman quickly stood up straight. The Hokage walked in and looked around, he nodded at the Anbu and then looked at the blonde and smiled happily to see him awake. "Naruto, how are you feeling?" asked the aged Hokage. "Like crap," replied the blonde looking at the Hokage. Now didn't have to be so rude," said Saratobi with a smile. "Why shouldn't I?" asked Naruto with a glare taking the Hokage by surprise. I just found out that I have the Kyuubi in me and then I get these weird wings. He growled in anger. The Hokage and the cat mask Anbu could have sworn they saw his eyes going white for a second. So you know of the Kyuubi? The Hokage said in a low voice. Of course I fucking know. The blonde almost shouted in anger, making the old man sigh. I'm sorry, I wanted to tell you one day, but I was afraid of how you might take it. He said with sorrow. Naruto turned his head away and looked out the window. Don't worry old Mani, don't blame you, he said, closing his eyes. I blame the council of Konoha and its citizens. He shouted in anger, startling those in the room. Why is that, Uzumaki-san? The Anbu asked curiously as Naruto turned to look at her. Because they are too idiotic to realize that I am not the fox and yet they still try to hurt me and deny things for me. He said in a low voice. The Hokage flinched hearing that. Still, he said, trying to lighten the mood. I have a surprise, Naruto. He said as the blonde looked at him. And what is that? Asked Naruto with an eyebrow up. The origin of Konoha after your display. He said, handing him a headband. This is Iruka's. He said he wanted you to have it. Sandaime said with a smile. The blonde looked at the headband and grinned. He sat up and slowly walked towards the Hokage. As the blonde reached the old man, he took the headband and tied it on his right arm. He then looked up and moved his hands behind his head and grabbed his hood and pulled it over his head. Then he looked up at the Hokage and grinned. All that the aged man could see was the grin. Why did you cover your face? Asked the Hokage. I don't know, the blonde replied. I felt like I wanted to, he said, not certain on himself. Did what happened to me? He asked, looking up at the aged man. The Hokage looked at the boy with sympathy. You use two ancient jutsus that I am afraid I do not know what they do. Apparently one gave you a sword that is now strapped to your waist. He said, and true to his words, when Naruto looked down he saw the sword strapped to his waist. The second gave you angel-like wings. Can I revert this? Asked Naruto. I don't know, we never saw someone use the jutsus before. I have nothing on it. I stayed up all night trying to understand what it is, but there was nothing. Explained the Hokage. There are no records whatsoever. I am afraid you are stuck like that. Said the Hokage with an apologizing look. Naruto sighed in annoyance. Great, just what I need. Now the villagers will demand my head because I am imposing as an angel. Said the blonde. The old man chuckled despite the fact that it might be true what the blonde said. And because of that I came up with a temporary solution. As he heard that, the blonde looked up in surprise, trying to understand what the Hokage's solution was. I asked our Jinjutsu specialist to place a Jinjutsu on you. It will hide your wings and cloak and make you look well like you looked before. The Sandaime said with a smile present on his face. Naruto lightened up as he heard that. Sure, he liked the wings and the thought that he could use them to fly and have the upper hand against his enemies crossed his mind. But he didn't want to risk having people hating him more than they already do. Sure, they would be surprised when they see his wings and all that, but later they might start reverting back to their old train of thoughts, and usually nothing good comes from that. As he looked at his wings once more, he eagerly nodded to the Hokage. He wanted to hide for the moment. It wouldn't do him any bad after all, since he involuntarily hid the fact that he held the Kyuubi inside of him from his generation and the younger ones. And at the same that he was still keeping a secret hidden, so deadly that it could destroy the very balance of Konoha. He giggled silently as he remembered everyone's faces when he pulled that one prank. No one could backtrack it to him, seeing as he was in the hospital the whole time. The old man raised an eyebrow as he saw the blonde's body moving strangely, like he was laughing. He shook his head thinking that the blonde was laughing happily, thinking that he could walk the streets without fear, or that he could eat at Ichiraku's without having people stare at his back in wonder. If only he knew the truth, he'd realize who the culprit behind the soap crisis was 3 years ago. The old man shook his head as he turned around and walked outside. The blonde watched as the Hokage stopped outside the door and seemed to talk to someone to his right. After a few seconds the Sandaime nodded and stepped out of the way. A woman with long black hair, ruby red eyes and wearing jounin clothing walked in. As she walked in, the Hokage also stepped back into the room and closed the door behind him. The Anbu then made several hand seals and then lowered her hands. Naruto didn't understand what the Anbu had done, and he probably will never for a few years. His attention was on the newcomer, however. He felt her eyes on him. She was staring at his wings. It made him uncomfortable as he shuffled nervously and looked around the room trying to avoid her gaze. Realizing that she was making the boy nervous, the jounin closed her eyes and then opened them and turned towards the Hokage. The old man smiled calmly as he nodded towards her. She sighed and turned back towards the boy and offered a small reassuring smile. Seeing the smile, the blonde felt a bit more relaxed. Don't worry, this won't hurt at all. She told him as she raised her hands and prepared to cast the illusion. Will people be able to see through it? The blonde inquired as the jounin shook her head with a smile. I'm not the best around for nothing. She said with a giggle as she started doing the hand seals. A few moments later the blonde felt strange. He felt like he couldn't see clearly for a second. "It's done," he heard the jounin say. Curious, the blonde looked down at his hand and frowned when he saw the sleeve of his robe. He looked behind and whined as he saw that the wings were still present there. He turned towards the jounin and glared. "I can still see them," he said as the woman smiled and shook her head. "Yes, you can still see them," she told him as the blonde looked puzzled. "The genjutsu will affect those around you, think of it like this. You are now inside a bubble that shows your former self, people cannot see past that bubble. But seeing as you are inside the bubble you can still see your real self," she explained to the boy as he opened his mouth and then closed it. "So no one can see through it?" he asked a bit skeptical as the woman frowned, thinking that the blonde might doubt her abilities. "Bulanbu level ninjas and cage ones might see through it and several jounin as well," she told him and then pointed to his chest. The blonde looked down and for the first time he saw a strange necklace attached to him. That necklace will maintain the genjutsu, it has its own chakra source, and the jutsu will draw chakra from its reserves. You can refill it, but Hokage-sama will tell you how to do that. And if by any chance your genjutsu fades please seek me out," she said with a smile as she bowed slightly and then left the room. As the door closed behind the jounin, the Sandaime turned towards Naruto and looked at him sternly. The blonde gulped slightly. "Naruto, what happened to you is considered an S-rank secret. No one, and I mean no one, is allowed to know of your current situation until we figure out a way to reverse it," he said as the blonde nodded with a grin. The old man smiled pleased. "Now, you should head over to the academy, same class, it's time for your assignment." Naruto didn't need to be told twice as he dashed out of the room with a big smile on his face. The Hokage looked at the open door with a smile that soon disappeared. "I'm sorry Naruto beauty, think you sealed your fate," he thought sadly as he looked towards the Anbu and dismissed her. He closed his eyes as the ninja vanished in a plume of smoke and took a deep breath. Out of all the bad things that could have happened to Naruto, but then again, it might not be such a bad thing like the Nidaime had told him. As Naruto reached the academy he slowed down a bit and started walking towards the entrance. He looked at the large building before him and a smile crept on his face. He had finally made it, he was now a ninja. Even though he had passed under certain circumstances and he didn't pass by orthodox methods, he was still a ninja. It didn't really bother him that he didn't pass like all the others, for him it was good enough that he could finally get some action and live the life that he had dreamt of. He could now make easy money, or at least in his opinion it was easy money, and he could go on dangerous missions to save damsels in distress. It wasn't long, and the blonde reached his old classroom. He looked at the door and memories flooded his mind as he remembered all those years when he came to class to listen to boring lectures, or the times he skipped classes to do what he wanted to do. He snickered at all those times he pulled pranks on the teachers and on Iruka. His smile dropped a bit as he remembered the Chunin, thoughts about the Mizuki incident flooded his mind. He was this close to losing one of those that loved him for whom he was, he didn't want that to happen. He sighed as he placed his hand on the doorknob. "Get out of my way, pig." He heard the voice of the girl he had a crush on. He turned to greet her, his eyes widened when he saw Sakura and her longtime rival Ino racing towards him while glaring at each other. "Wait." Naruto shouted as he raised his hands up defensively trying to make them stop. The call went unheard as the girls crashed in him with full force, making him fly into a nearby wall. "I win." They both shouted and ran into the classroom as Naruto tried to regain his senses. The blonde sighed sadly as he shook his head. That girl, will she ever recognize him? Will she ever go out with him like he had always wanted? He shook his head and then bumped himself in the head. He didn't need to think like this, not now. There was no point in negative thoughts. He placed a smile on his face as he walked inside the class. The first thing he did as he walked in was to see who passed the exams, he wanted to see who his potential teammates would be. He wasn't that dumb, he knew, actually he remembered what Iruka told him, ninjas work in teams. So he knew that he would get a team no matter what he tried to do. As he looked around the class he saw that all the heirs of prestigious clans had said no wonder. "What are you doing here, loser?" he heard someone ask, judging from the tone and the voice itself, it could only be that mutt, Inuzuka Kiba. The blonde groaned as he didn't want to deal with this. "I passed the exam," the boy said in a bored voice as he looked towards the Inuzuka. Said boy looked at Naruto oddly before looking for his headband. Naturally he looked up at his forehead. "Ha!" he shouted like he was victories or something like that. "Then where is your headband?" he demanded pointing towards the blonde's forehead, making his eyebrows twitch. "Not everyone wears their headband on their forehead," the blonde said in an annoyed tone as he pointed towards his headband, tied to his right arm. The dog boy looked at the blonde's arm and saw the headband, he laughed nervously and then crossed his arms on his chest and huffed. "How was I supposed to know?" he asked himself quietly, hoping that Naruto wouldn't hear him. The blonde smiled as he shook his head. "I'm sitting next to Sasuke-kun." They both heard a shriek and simultaneously turned towards the sound's origin. They saw the two major Sasuke fangirls fighting over who will stay next to the boy in question. Said boy was looking away trying to ignore them. The blonde boy looked down in sadness, he once more shook his head as he realized that there was no point in being sad or sorry for something he can try and stop. Now that he was a ninja he still had a chance of impressing Sakura and having her go out with him, and then maybe later knows what might happen. The young boy sighed happily as Kiba turned towards him and saw the look in his eyes. He smacked his head in annoyance, Naruto was helpless, completely hopeless. Just as he was about to say something Naruto started walking away. As the boy passed him his scent moved in the dog boy's nose, his companion raised his head as he barked towards his master. Kiba blinked trying to understand what he just felt or more like what he just didn't feel. Uzumaki Naruto suddenly had no scent. Before today he used to smell like ramen and fox, but now he didn't smell like anything. It was strange. I know Akamaru. The boy whispered as the dog kept barking towards him trying to get his attention. As the words left his mouth the dog stopped barking and turned towards the blonde boy who was trying to get Sakura to talk to him. Leave me alone Naruto. You're annoying. The pink-haired girl screeched as the blonde flinched. Kiba shook his head at the boy's dumbness, why did he keep trying? He could easily try and go for someone else, hell a civilian would be good as well. As long as she wasn't flat-chested like Haruno. He silently made gagging noises as the dog barked towards him. The boy chuckled to himself as he walked back to his seat. Naruto looked down at the ground dejected as the girl he loved rejected him like that again. He grits his teeth as he raised his head a little and looked towards the origin of his hatred, Uchiha Sasuke. The punk that hogged all the attention just because he was the last Uchiha and had good marks. If it wasn't for his status as jailer of Kyuubi, Naruto knew for sure that he could have been number one in class and he could have humiliated Sasuke. He walked towards the boy and grabbed him by the collar, making the Uchiha look at him in surprise. Sasuke raised an eyebrow as Naruto did something he had never done before. He openly grabbed him, he could see the anger in his eyes. Everyone was silent after the small display. Naruto was still holding the prodigy by his collar, said prodigy didn't do anything, he just looked back at the blonde. Leave Sasuke-kun alone you brat. The two fangirls shouted simultaneously as they bonked him in the head. Naruto's grip on the boy's collar dropped as he raised his hands to rub his head. He looked back towards the two girls with sad eyes, more like towards Sakura, but it didn't seem like she realized it. He then turned towards the Uchiha and glared one more time as he closed in. I hate you. He whispered in a low voice as the Uchiha's eyes narrowed a bit. I have the same thoughts about you. Sasuke said back in a whisper as he glared towards the blonde. Naruto. The pink-haired girl shouted enraged as she hit him on the head once more, making the blonde stumble and fall on Sasuke. The room was silent as the blonde was now on top of the Uchiha, his left hand on his chest and his lips connected with Sasuke's, both of them were wide-eyed and pale. Sasuke for his part was frightened and angry at the same time. Frightened cause the blonde had his hand on her chest and he could discover her secret. Angry because the brat had the guts to steal her first kiss, something she had been saving for the one she would marry when she would reveal herself. Ah! The blonde shouted as he jumped away like he had been burned. He brought his hands onto his mouth and started wiping it in disgust. Seeing this made the Uchiha matter, but she had to keep her cool, she couldn't let people realize that she wasn't a he. But still that brat had the guts to say, even though he wasn't using words, that he didn't enjoy that kiss. That she wasn't good enough. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The fangirls will get him, the fangirls will get him she chanted over and over in her head as she opened her eyes and looked at the blonde deadly. Hope you burn dope. She said in her male voice as she turned around and ignored everyone once more, though inside she was feeling strange. Her first interaction like this with the other gender, even though she was disguised in a genjutsu as a male, it was still something. She didn't imagine it like this, definitely not like this. She could feel her face burning up for the first time in years. For the first time in years, ever since her clan's massacre she was embarrassed and she was blushing. She had to hide it, definitely had to hide it. Thinking fast, she let her head drop on the table and covered her head with her arms. Look what you did Naruto. Shouted the girls, not only did you steal Sasuke-kun's first kiss, but you made him cry. They shouted as the blonde gulped knowing that pain was coming his way and fast. Good morning class. Everyone heard someone call as they turned towards the door. They saw Iruka walking in with a smile on his face. The blonde sighed in relief, they wouldn't beat him in front of Iruka, definitely not in front of him. He looked up and saw the girls looking at him. They all raised their fingers at their throats and made a slicing motion with their fingers. He gulped, it was fucked, definitely fucked. Please everyone take a seat, it's time for team arrangements. The Chunin said as Naruto walked to his seat and slowly sat down. He looked towards his left and saw Sasuke glaring at him from the corner of his eyes, he thought he saw him blushing. He shook his head, there was no way he would show something like that. He looked towards his right and saw Sakura looking at him dangerously as she was slowly punching her left palm with her fist. Naruto gulped as he turned towards the Chunin and sat quietly in his seat stiff as a board. "Alright, the teams are as follow," the man started as he began listing off who is in which team. Naruto listened to the first couple teams, he barely knew the people that were placed in those teams. He silently sighed as he looked to his left with the corner of his eyes, he let out a relieved sigh as Sasuke wasn't looking towards him anymore and he looked towards his right and then looked back in front. Sakura was still murderously glaring at him. Team 7 will be Uzumaki Naruto, the Chunin said as the blonde started listening fully. Haruno Sakura, the blonde, raised his hands in the air in victory and immediately let them drop as pain moved through his body from his wings. His eyes widened, he could feel pain in his wings. He looked behind and saw he hit the table behind him with his wings and it hurt him. And Sasuke-cha. The Chunin said as the blonde's eyes widened in horror. He was on the same team with him. With that bastard that was hogging all the attention. His head dropped on the table as he heard Sakura cheer and shout something he didn't understand. Now he knew that he didn't have any chances with her. Ach, the blonde shouted as he felt his wings itching. He moved his hand behind him and scratched his back around his shoulder blades. It was itchy and he didn't like it. He sighed relieved as the itching vanished. He opened his eyes and saw everyone staring at him. He sighed as his head dropped on the table. This just keeps better and better. The blonde said to himself as they tried to block out everyone around him and try to focus on thinking. Naruto was angry, he was very angry. Just 2 hours ago Iruka had finished saying who was in which team, 5 minutes later Jounin started coming and picking up their teams. 30 minutes ago Iruka went home and Team 7 was still waiting for their damn Jounin sensei to arrive. The blonde gripped the edge of the table in anger as his eyes flashed red for a second. He didn't like tardiness, when that sensei shows up he will give him a piece of his mind. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath to calm down, he had to calm down. He then remembered his incident with Sasuke, he felt like puking. But still, Sasuke's chest, it didn't feel right. The blonde raised his hand up and started closing it and opening it. When he touched Sasuke something felt different. He placed his hand on his chest and then thought back at what he felt when he touched the Uchiha. It was definitely different. It was too soft and he was sure that Sasuke was not like that. A few rows back the boy in question looked pale, the blonde was making strange motions with the hand he had touched his chest. He closed his eyes and grits his teeth in anger, the bastard had felt her. He groped her. He will die, definitely had to die. Her eyes snapped open as she opened her mouth to shout at the blonde. Just as she was about to do that the door opened and everyone turned towards it. A silver-haired man stepped into the room and looked at its occupants with a bored look. "Well, you're all boring," he said as everyone raised an eyebrow in confusion. "Meet me on the roof," he said before vanishing in a plum of smoke. It was then that they realized that man was their Jounin sensei, it was then that they realized he had called them a bunch of boring people. Naruto's eyebrows twitched in anger as he sat up and started storming towards the roof with the intent to give his sensei a piece of his mind. His teammates soon followed, but at a slower pace, Naruto was acting strange, stranger than ever before. As Sasuke and Sakura reached the roof they were greeted by a strange sight. Their blonde teammate was sitting on the floor, cross-legged with his hands crossed over his chest and looking pissed while their sensei was leaning over the rail and reading a strange orange book. The man lowered his book a little and told them to take a seat next to their blonde friend. They did as they were told. Everyone stood in silence for several minutes, the only sound that could be heard were the birds and the Jounin flipping through the book's pages. He then looked up at his student and said, "Introduce yourselves." They looked between each other confused as to what they were supposed to say exactly. Sakura decided to speak their thoughts. Sensei, would you start first?" She asked shyly as the other two nodded in agreement. The Jounin sighed as he closed his book and pocketed it. He crossed his hands over his chest and looked at the team. "My name is Kakashi, I like many things, I dislike little things, my hobbies are not for you, and my dream you cannot understand it." He introduced himself with a smile behind his mask as the team face faltered, realizing that the only thing they learned was the man's name. "You go next, Blondie," the man said with a smile while pointing towards the blonde boy who twitched in annoyance. "Fine," he grumbled as he looked at the silver-haired man. "I'm Uzumaki Naruto, I like ramen, sleeping and training, I dislike arrogant people, and the 10 minutes it takes to cook the ramen, my hobbies are training, pranking." He grinned as his sensei stiffened for a second and reading. Everyone looked at him with wide eyes. "Naruto. Uzumaki Naruto read books. What?" the blonde asked curiously as he felt everyone stare at him. "Memi dream is to become Hokage and be accepted by everyone," he proclaimed happily as everyone sighed. "Pretty," the man said pointing towards Sasuke whose eyebrows twitched in annoyance. "Uchiha Sasuke, I don't have many likes, I dislike a lot and I have no hobbies and my dream me ambition is to kill a certain man and revive my clan." he said in a dark voice as Sakura squealed and Naruto rolled his eyes. Oh yes, he then stated. And to make someone painterly, he told them as his eyes moved towards the blonde for a second. Naruto saw that and gulped silently as he chuckled nervously. Right, Kakashi said as he blinked. He turned towards the last member of the team and pointed towards her. You pinky. The girl fumed at the nickname and crossed her arms. She slightly raised her head up and started talking. I'm Haruno Sakura, I like. She looked towards Sasuke and lowered her head a bit. My hobbies are. She looked towards the Uchiha once more as her head lowered again. My dream is. She giggled as she looked towards the same person for the third time. Ugh, your dislikes? The Jounin asked. He just had to have a fangirl. Out of the types of girls he could have had in his team, he had to have a damned fangirl. Be no pig and Naruto baka. She shouted to the heavens as the blonde's head dropped in disappointment. Sasuke smirked towards the blonde but tried to hide it, and Kakashi just shook his head as he stood up straight. Alright, listen here everyone. They did as they were told. They inched closer towards the Jounin and listened to what he had to say. Tomorrow at 6 in the morning we will do survival training. I expect you to be on time and not to it, understood? He asked as everyone nodded. Hey, wait a minute. The blonde said as everyone turned towards him. Why shouldn't we eat? He asked as his teammates thought over it and then nodded in agreement. Unless you enjoy puking your guts, I suggest you don't eat. The Jounin replied with an eye smile as he vanished in a plum of smoke and left everyone rooted in their spot deathly pale. HN. The Uchiha said after a few moments of silence. He turned around and started walking away. The pink-haired girl shook herself out of her stupor and turned towards the object of her affection. Sasuke-kun. She chirped as the boy stopped. You want to go out? She asked as the boy slightly turned his head towards her and glared. No, you're annoying. He said as he turned around and started walking away, once more leaving a dejected Sakura behind. The blonde watched the interaction between them and got angry. Why was that Sasuke being such a jerk? Hey Sakura-chan. He called out as he walked next to her. Why don't you go out with me? He asked happily as the girl turned towards him and glared hard. I won't go out with you. She screeched as the boy took a step back in fright. I hate you, Naruto, you're annoying and always getting in my way and my love for Sasuke. She said as she huffed and turned around, starting to walk away, probably to find Sasuke and ask him out again or stalk him. The blonde boy looked down at the ground dejected. He sighed heavily, just like all the other days when he asked her out. She would say no and storm off. He would be sad for a few hours and then he would feel better again and chase after her in the morning. He chuckled to himself, that's what he always does. Then his head rose as he blinked. That was indeed what he always did, but why? He asked himself and found the answer immediately, because he feels attached to her, that's why. He nodded to himself triumphantly as he started walking away towards his home. As he was walking down the streets he could feel someone watching him. He looked around with the corner of his eyes, but no matter how hard he tried he couldn't spot anyone. The feeling of being watched made him nervous. He suddenly felt like a trapped rat, despite the fact that he was walking through the crowded streets of Konoha, which he rarely did due to the fact that people tend to don't like him around them. He picked up the pace wanting to get away from whoever was watching him. Sure, the villagers would look at him or glare at his back, but that was different. What he felt now was completely different. It was like the one watching him was the one that would end him. He definitely didn't want that to happen. Suddenly he felt like the one watching him was behind him. He turned around, but there was no one following him. People around him were moving as far as they could. He started shaking. For the first time in years he was afraid again. He felt insecure once more. He turned around slowly and without a warning he started dashing down the streets, taking through the alleys and the rooftops to get away from whoever was following him. It didn't take long and he could feel the presence disappearing. He could feel safe once more. He sighed in relief as he jumped down from a rooftop and started walking back home. This day was getting really strange. It was dark, the streets were empty. Just Ninja could be seen passing through the streets from time to time. Everyone was sleeping by now, all civilians and young genin were sound asleep. In his apartment, the young blonde could be seen sleeping peacefully in his bed with his face on the pillow and his back to the ceiling. He couldn't sleep on his back due to his wings. He hated them now, he wanted to get rid of them, but until the old man found a way to get rid of them, he had to endure it. A snore was heard in the room as the blonde started mumbling in his sleep. Everything seemed peaceful, but it only seemed so. Deep inside the boy's mindscape, two red eyes opened and an evil grin appeared in the darkness. Flames erupted around the figure as it started plotting. But the boy's insolence and foolishness, they might have a chance once more. Their armies will stomp over them like they did millennia ago, and they will win once more and rule over these pathetic creatures. No one was going to stop them, absolutely no one. The blonde grumbled in his sleep and then shivered. His eyes snapped open as he sat up on his bed and looked around. His eyes rested on the window which was open. He raised an eyebrow. Did he open the window? He shook his head not remembering, he concentrated, but he could feel no one in the room. Shrugging, the blonde walked away from the bed and towards the window. As he reached the window he was about to close it when he stood frozen in shock at what he was seeing. Konoha was burning. The entire village was burning, ninja and civilian alike were all over the place, dead. Some impaled with spikes, other ripped to shred by Kami knows what. He could see some civilians running through the village and screaming in horror, some protecting their children as they ran. The blonde heard a roar and looked up. He stopped breathing at what he was seeing. In the middle of Konoha was a large gate, two large skeletons holding large swords and chains, seemed to be the pillar for the gate. Its gates from what it seemed were lying on the ground and a strange vortex could be seen between the pillars. The blonde started shaking and breathing irregularly as he saw many creatures walking out of the portal, strange animal-like creatures, skeletons, zombies, ghost demons. Big, Smelthy were all walking out of the portal and killing everyone and everything around them in one swipe. His eyes widened when he saw a figure impaled on top of the portal. He tried to see who the figure was, tried to make sense of it. The blonde screamed as he suddenly jumped from his bed. He looked around, he was in his room once more. His eyes widened as he jumped from his bed and ran to his window which was closed. He looked outside, there was nothing. Yes, he could see Konoha, but it wasn't burning, he couldn't see that demonic gate or whatever it was. He couldn't see the dead or the demons walking through the streets. He sighed as he realized he just had a nightmare. A really bad one. Walking back to his bed, the blonde dropped like a sack of potatoes and took another deep breath. He closed his eyes and tried to calm himself, he needed to be ready for tomorrow. He started thinking of positive things, of his dream, his ambition, of the future. He smiled as he succumbed to the darkness of his sleep. Everything was going to be alright, nightmares are just like that, nightmares, nothing more. Sarutobi was working just like any other day, though he wasn't feeling very good. His heart was racing and he didn't know why, it was like his inner conscious knew that something would happen sooner or later. He kept working on his papers until he accidentally spilled the ink on a document. His hand stopped above the document. Was this a bad omen? Will something bad happen? He shook his head trying to dismiss the bad thoughts. Sandame Hokage, here is in Sarutobi. A voice said, it sounded like it came from everywhere, it held power, great power. Sarutobi felt his hands shaking, he looked up shakily and his eyes widened in fright. The four Anbu stationed in the room collapsed on their knees, their jinjutsu fading. They were shivering from the power emanating in the room. No. The story is legends, they're true. The old man shouted frantically in his mind as he gazed at the figure before him. Archangel Chapter 2. Blessing and Curse. The sound of an alarm clock ringing could be heard in the blonde boy's room. Naruto groaned as he slammed his fist on the clock, shattering yet another one. He raised his head from his pillow, his eyes hurt. He got out of bed and walked into the bathroom, it took a lot of effort from him to do that. As he got in the bathroom he looked up at the mirror, his eyes had black rims around them. He could barely get any sleep last night, those nightmares still appeared in his mind, no matter how hard he tried to get rid of them. He splashed some water on his face as he raised his head and looked in the mirror. He shouted in fright as a pair of red eyes looked back at him. He shook his head and looked at the mirror again. He could see his reflection. A sigh escaped his lips, he just couldn't understand what was happening to him all of a sudden. Before today he didn't have any problems like this, heck yesterday when he had those wings nothing bad happened and he didn't hallucinate or anything like that. The blonde lowered his head and grabbed the sink as he looked down at the water. He stood in silence for a few minutes, not even thinking about anything, he just watched the water in the sink. Naruto closed his eyes and sighed heavily as he stood up straight and looked in the mirror, nothing changed, it was his own reflection. Smiling, the blonde closed the water and walked out of the bathroom towards his kitchen. As he got there the first thing he did was walk to his refrigerator. He grabbed the handle and opened it, looking through the food he tried to think what he could use. Grabbing some milk he looked at the expiration date, he frowned seeing it expired a month ago. His face turned into a disgusted look as he threw the carbon box in the trash can without a second thought. He then looked back in the refrigerator, but he couldn't find anything edible. He frowned as he shut the door to the refrigerator and looked through his cupboards. A few minutes later the blonde decided on making himself some instant ramen. 10 minutes later his food was done, he took the cup and sat down at the table when he remembered Kakashi said not to eat. He shrugged deciding to eat anyway as he already prepared his food. Looking down in his cup his eyes widened in horror as he felt like puking. He screamed and threw the cup out the window and grabbed his head, his eyes were wide. What the hell was happening to him? What in blazes was going on? Naruto shook his head several times trying to dismiss his thoughts. He stood up and threw his chopsticks in the trash can. Sighing he walked back into his room to get ready for the team meeting, his first meeting. He smiled at that, he would get to be in the same team with Sakura and he will work hard to prove that he wasn't a loser and that he was worth the time. He would make her fall in love with him and all will be good. As he finished getting dressed, the blonde walked out of his apartment and closed the door behind him. He then jumped down on the street from his floor and started running towards the training grounds. Up on the rooftops, two Anbu looked at the retreating form of the boy. They had witnessed his reactions. One of them jumped down from the roof and walked under the boy's kitchen window. He looked at the cup of ramen that was lying on the ground. The contents were spilled on the ground, but nothing seemed out of place with it. The ninja turned towards his partner, who shrugged, not knowing what to say. "Let's report to the Hokage," his partner suggested as the man looked down at the cup in his hand and nodded before letting it drop on the ground once more. Something was wrong with the young boy, and the Hokage had to know about this. As Naruto reached the training grounds, he saw that he was the last one to arrive. Sakura and Sasuke were already there. The Uchiha was sitting under a tree and brooding, while the girl still seemed to be asleep, as she wasn't trying to get the boy's attention and was falling asleep from what it seemed. Naruto smiled as he saw the girl looking at him. He raised his hand and waved towards his teammates as a smile appeared on his face. "Morning, guys," he shouted happily as Sasuke turned towards Naruto and raised an eyebrow, seeing the bangs under the blonde's eyes. He wondered if the boy slept last night or if he was so excited about today that he couldn't get any sleep. He shook his head and looked away. The idiot was not worth the time and definitely not worth worrying about. He could handle himself up until now. He could handle his fatigue for now. "Naruto?" asked Sakura, also noticing the bangs under his eyes. She also noticed the fact that the blonde was shaking a little and that he wasn't running normally. He seemed very tired for some strange reason. "Hey, Sakura-chan." Naruto greeted with a big smile as he closed his eyes. The girl blinked before frowning at him. "Baka, did you sleep last night?" she asked as she crossed her hands on her chest. The blonde looked down as he laughed nervously. I was too excited about today and barely slept," he replied to them as they blinked towards him. Sasuke shook his head and muttered dope, while Sakura frowned before glaring hard at the blonde and making him flinch slightly. "Baka. If we fail because of you, I will make sure you suffer," she scolded angrily as the blonde raised his hand up in defense. "We won't," he swore as the girl nodded and said that it better be that way. The blonde sighed as he dropped on the ground and looked at his teammates. Seeing as Sakura was fully awake, she was now starting to try and get Sasuke's attention. Naruto blinked as he felt his eyes dropping. He started wobbling around even though he was sitting on the ground. "I'm so tired," the blonde thought as he felt his eyes dropping. "Kakashi-sensei isn't here. I think I can get a shut-eye just a minute," he thought as he fell on the ground on his back. A few light snores indicated he had fallen asleep. His teammates looked at him and blinked. The pink-haired girl grinded her teeth in anger. If their sensei suddenly shows up and fails them because Naruto is asleep, then she will kill him. She stood up and walked towards the blonde with the intent to wake him up. Seeing this, Sasuke decided to intervene. "Sakura," he said as the girl stopped and looked at the raven-haired boy. "Leave him's no use, tired," he said as the girl thought about it and nodded dumbly. Her mind then clicked as she realized that the raven-haired boy had just talked to her. She squealed in her mind as she hopped back to her spot near the Uchiha, who was twitching madly. He just had to open his damn mouth. As Sasuke was focusing on ignoring the pincat and said pincat was focusing on drawing his attention, neither of them saw the blonde twitching on the ground and mumbling incoherent words. The blonde turned in his sleep and started to thrash around, movements that went unnoticed by his teammates as each one of them was focused on something else. A few hours later, 2 hours to be more exact, the blonde woke up sweating heavily and panting. He raised his hand to his face as he wiped the sweat. He then placed his hand on his chest and closed his eyes, trying to calm himself down. He had the nightmares again. He dreamt the same thing once more. Konoha burning, the large gates, the demons, the people running around screaming and fried. Only thing he couldn't see clearly was the man impaled on the top of the gate. He still couldn't see his face clearly or what he was wearing, and it made him curious as to whom he was. Standing up, the blonde looked around trying to see where his teammates are and hoping that he didn't miss the training. He didn't want to miss out on a chance to prove himself to the girl he loves. His eyes then rested on his teammates that were sitting under a tree sleeping lightly. He shook his head and sighed in relief. Their sensei had yet to come. That was a good thing. Seeing as his teammates were sleeping, they didn't see him thrashing in his sleep. He didn't want to look weak or anything like that. It was the last thing he needed. The puff of smoke alerted the blonde of their sensei's arrival. It also woke up his teammates. Sakura rubbed her eyes and then looked around. "Yo, their sensei," said as her eyes rested on him. The girl fumed as she pointed towards the jounin and shouted angrily. "You're late." A black cat crossed my path, so I had to walk around the village to get here," he said with an eye smile as Sasuke looked at him skeptical, wondering what kind of sensei he was thinking that they would buy such a lame excuse for his tardiness. "Liar." Both Naruto and Sakura shouted at the same time as the jounin just kept smiling at them. He then moved his hand in his pocket and took out a watch. He placed it on a tree stump next to him and looked towards his genin with an eye smile as they waited for him to tell them what they were going to do. "This is what we will do, I have here 2 bells," he said as he raised his left hand up showing them the bells. "Your task is to get one, the one that doesn't will be tied to that stump." He pointed towards the stump in question. "You have until noon." "Sensei?" asked Sakura as the jounin turned towards her. "Why do we have to take them?" she asked, wondering what kind of training this was. "This is your final test, if you fail it you will be sent back to the academy," he told them with an eye smile as the 3 genin paled hearing what he just said. They thought that the test they took in the academy was the last one, which they assumed meant they didn't have to take any other tests. Before anyone could complain, Kakashi hit the watch and looked at them. "Time's ticking," he said in a sing-song voice as Sasuke's eyes narrowed and jumped away in a place to hide, shortly followed by Sakura. The jounin looked with pride as his students knew what they were doing, well almost all. Turning towards the blonde boy he saw him looking at him sternly with his hands crossed over his chest confidently. "You're a strange one," the jounin said with a deadpan look as the blonde's eyebrows twitched. "The only thing strange is your hair," he shouted towards the jounin who merely smiled at him making the blonde angrier. Without a second thought the genin dashed forward towards his sensei with the intent on getting one of the bells, or both of them. He could give one to Sakura and show his affection for the girl. He mentally grinned at that. Kakashi shook his head at the direct approach the blonde was using, it was never going to work against him. The kid was still too young to be able to take him on in hand-to-hand combat or by himself for that matter. He moved his hand inside his pouch and the blonde stopped waiting for the jounin to take out his weapon or whatever he was aiming for. To his and his teammates' surprise, the jounin took out the same orange book they saw him reading yesterday. The boy's eyebrows twitched at the smiling sensei, it seemed like the man was mocking him. Naruto took a deep breath and locked eyes with his sensei, he charged forward once more. The man would be easier to take down now that his hands are occupied with that book. Just as the blonde reached the jounin he began throwing barrages of fists and kicks towards the man. Said man was dodging all of them with ease while reading his book, acting as if he wasn't even being attacked, this made the blonde angrier. Lesson number 1. To jutsu. The jounin declared as he grabbed the boy's hands and jumped behind him in a crouching position. "Never leave your back unguarded," he said with a grin as he placed his fingers in the tiger seal and poked the blonde in the ass. Naruto's mouth dropped in shock as he was sent flying away, a few moments later he fell in the nearby lake. Kakashi chuckled to himself as he saw the blonde fall in the lake. He shook his head and waited for the blonde to come out and try again or start raging and call him a pervert or whatever. To his shock however, as the blonde emerged from the lake, he could see him holding a strange sword. It was fascinating, the weapon, it seemed like it was drawing him towards it. He shook his head as he realized the blonde was close to him and ready to strike with his weapon. With a quick substitution, the jounin disappeared and instead of him a log appeared. The blonde cut the log in two with his sword and grit his teeth in anger. First he was humiliated with that technique and now with this. Sure he had a humiliating jutsu, the sexy no jutsu, but that was something different, he didn't go around poking his fingers in others men's asses. He looked around trying to spot his sensei until he felt his presence behind him. With a swift turn the blonde swiped the air behind him, his sensei had ducked under the attack. From the look in his eyes it seemed like he was really impressed with the blonde's reflexes. Still too slow, the man stated as he moved behind the blonde once more and grabbed his arms and pulled him towards him. It was at that moment that he felt something blocking him, he could even see that he couldn't move the blonde's body closer to use his attack, it was like an invisible barrier was blocking him. "Ah!" The blonde screamed in pain, making Kakashi wonder what the hell was going on. He saw the murderous look in the blonde's eyes and immediately let him go as the blonde raised his sword and cut his headband making it fall on the ground. With his Sharingan revealed, the man could only stare at what he was seeing. The boy in front of him, he was covered in a genjutsu and underneath that genjutsu it was like he was looking at an angel. There was no blonde boy, yes, the person in front of him was as tall as Naruto, but he was wearing a white robe, a white hood over his head that covered his entire face, he couldn't see his eyes or his mouth. He had gauntlets on his hands and on his back two angel-like wings, a few inches bigger than he was. The jounin was shaken out of his stupor when he saw the angel charge towards him with his sword, a sloppy stance he noted, but dangerous it seemed. Kakashi now realized that he wasn't dealing with an ordinary kid anymore, this was something he had never dealt with before. Placing his book back in his pouch, he took out his kunai and looked at the attacker seriously. He would draw blood if needed. A few moments later and their weapons connected with each other, Kakashi noticed that he was faster than the angel and swifter. Using this to his advantage, the man grabbed the boy's arm and threw him over his shoulder into a tree. As Naruto hit the tree the jounin vanished from sight and appeared above the angel, with his kunai ready to strike. However, he couldn't bring himself to strike. If he did kill the person before him, then that would mean he would kill an actual angel. But it would also mean that he would kill Naruto. He then noticed the boy moving towards his sword as silently as he could. Without wasting any time, the man grabbed the boy and with a few movements, he managed to tie him upside down to a tree. He sighed as he walked towards his headband and picked it up. He closed his Sharingan eye and replaced the headband cloth. He then tied the piece of metal back around his forehead and lowered it over his special eye. Finally, the Jounin turned towards the angel and was surprised to see Naruto there hanging upside down. He shook his head remembering that he first saw a Genjutsu, but that would mean that underneath this Naruto was an angel. Or that the Naruto he was seeing now was actually the illusion and underneath was the real deal. He definitely had to talk to the Hokage about this, he just had to know more about his student. Yes, he knew that he harbored the Kyuubi and he expected for him to look like a human fox later in his life, but an angel. That was way too much and he definitely had not expected that. He couldn't continue his train of thoughts as he felt something behind him. With another quick substitution he replaced himself with a log as 3 shuriken hit the log. From his hiding spot, Sasuke jumped away and started dashing through the forest, cursing himself for thinking that he could take down the Jounin that easily. His mind suddenly drifted towards the blonde, he wondered where he got that sword from and why Kakashi suddenly went so serious when he fought Naruto. Another thing that bothered him was why the Jounin had a Sharingan eye. As he kept running he suddenly heard Sakura scream, surely the Jounin had gotten her and maybe with something easy. As he kept running he came to the end of the forest and appeared in a clearing. He stopped as he felt like he was being watched. Taking out a shuriken he threw it towards the nearby tree, a few leaves fell to the ground as Kakashi landed behind him with an eye smile. "Wah, you felt me, Satsuki-chan," he said with a chuckle as Sasuke narrowed his eyes and looked at the silver-haired Jounin. "Don't call me that," she growled out in a feminine voice as the man chuckled slightly and got in a fighting stance. "Very well, Sasuke-chan," he mused as the boy fumed and charged forward. Kakashi as well as a handful of the Anbu and the Hokage knew the real gender of the prodigy Uchiha Sasuke. It was saddening that her father treated her like that. He didn't like the idea that a girl had been born in their family and since she was little she had a Genjutsu placed on her to keep her real gender hidden. But she found out by herself her true gender when she started finding herself attracted to boys or when she started having those strange feelings like most girls her age. It was then that her mother told her the truth. The bad part was that her father had heard as well and he sternly declared that if she would ever show her true gender and disgrace him, then she would be terminated. Satsuki had been devastated when her family had been massacred by her older brother, who also knew her secret but treated her like an older brother treats his younger sister. She was at the same time happy that her father died, though she would not say this to anyone. She was happy because now, after she had gained the power she needed, she could reveal her true self and live happily. Like she had always wanted when she was little, Kakashi chuckled as they were fighting remembering that she used to have a crush on Naruto when they were little. It was mostly due to the fact that Naruto was so carefree and that he could do anything he wanted without any parents berating him. She longed for that kind of life when her father used to be alive, now she longed for the family she lost to her mother and somewhere deep down for her brother as well, even though she would never openly say so. A few minutes passed, Sasuke had been defeated and he now lay buried under the ground. Their sensei was crouching a few feet away from him and smiling happily. He grit his teeth in anger as he tried to free himself. But he couldn't, he was trapped and only someone from outside could help him. The Jounin disappeared in a plume of smoke leaving him alone in the ground. He sighed in annoyance, why the hell did this have to happen to him? He was this close to grabbing that damn bell. He felt like screaming to the heavens in anger. As the alarm could be heard throughout the training field, Team 7 knew that they had failed their task and they were going to be sent back to the academy. Slowly they walked towards the training posts where Kakashi was waiting for them, he seemed rather unpleased with the outcome of the entire ordeal. Without a warning, the Jounin grabbed Naruto by the collar and tied him to a post. The blonde was stunned, he got tied to the post, he did more than the others did. His eyes flashed red for a second as the designs on his left gauntlet became more pronounced and the fox's eyes shined for a second. It also seemed like the fox grinned for a second. Before the blonde could ask why he was tied to the post, the Jounin decided to speak. "Well, you failed," he said as they all looked down in shame, indeed they had failed to get those damn bells. So now they were first going to get berated and then sent back to the academy. It angered both Sasuke and Naruto, they had worked so hard and now they were going to be sent back just because of some damn bells. "I have decided not to send you back to the academy," the Jounin said as everyone looked up in surprise, a smile appeared on the blonde's face and on the pink-haired girl. A small grin appeared on Sasuke's face as well as he realized that the Jounin would not dare send them back to the academy, he was relieved though that he didn't have to spend another damn year in that place. "You should all quit being ninjas," The Jounin shouted in anger as they all looked mortified at the news. You Sasuke did nothing to help your teammates, you Sakura did nothing to help Naruto when he was hanging upside down in that tree, and you Naruto didn't even try to get help from your teammates. He shouted furiously as everyone looked down in shame. Just as he was about to give them the second test he felt the presence of another ninja in the area. It wasn't well hidden as it seemed like the ninja wanted to be spotted. Looking towards a tree with the corner of his eyes, Kakashi could see an Anbu there. The ninja made a few hand signs towards the Jounin, whose eyes widened for a second. Apparently the Hokage wished an audience with him and his team, meaning that he had to pass them. He saw the Anbu saying that it's urgent and that they need to get there fast. Sighing, the Jounin turned towards his students and looked at them. He decided to cut things short and pass this team for now. Hopefully the Hokage knew what he was doing. You were placed in a team so you can work together. He said sternly as their eyes widened. They finally understood what they had to do from the start. Working together to achieve your goals, that's what teams are for, the Jounin said as he crossed his hands over his chest. We're sorry sensei. Naruto said with a downcast voice as the other two nodded, though Sasuke a bit slower than the others. The Jounin smiled as he untied the blonde. Come on, we got to meet the Hokage now. We are officially a team. He said as the three genin cheered. Kakashi looked towards the trees once more, the Anbu wasn't there anymore. He silently sighed as he hoped that the Hokage knew what he was doing. He knew that Sarutobi was wise and all that, and the fact that he knew a lot, but he was hoping he wouldn't go senile and just pass students like this and send them to their deaths. He shook those thoughts away. There was no way that the old man would go senile now or anytime soon. It didn't look that way at least, and hopefully it will never happen. Kakashi blinked in surprise. He didn't know what to say at what he just heard. Somehow he had a feeling that the Hokage had finally gone insane because of the paperwork. Or did he have a motive for what he was doing? He wasn't sure about that. What he was sure about was the fact that the Hokage just wanted them to take a mission. Now. His team just passed the exam and they had to do some training first. They had to do some team building. They had to do some D ranks before taking on a C rank. Excuse me Hokage-sama. Kakashi asked, shaking himself out of his stupor. His students were rooted in place, with their mouths open in shock at what they just heard. You heard me right Kakashi, I want your team to go on a C rank, but don't worry, it's not that much of a C rank, it's more like a D rank. The Hokage said with a smile, trying to reassure the Jounin who looked deathly pale. Maybe the man was envious that his team was taking a C rank right off the bat when he had to wait several weeks or months until he and the team he was working with could take their very first. Then why label it as a C rank? Asked Kakashi, crossing his hands over his chest and looking angry and curious at the same time. You might encounter some traps here, and Thoreno action like fighting bandits or ninja will occur. The old man said with a reassuring tone as the Jounin seemed to relax. Besides, a team of Anbu will be there as well to help. He said with a smile as Kakashi visibly relaxed. What do we have to do? Asked the silver-haired Jounin. That's simple, you have to retrieve an item and you will see it when you get there. He told them as they raised an eyebrow in confusion. Go to the market and go down in the canals. The team's eyebrows twitched as they heard that. They were starting to doubt this is C rank or some bullshit like that. Turn to your right and keep going down until you see the team of Anbu. From there you will know what you have to do. The old man said, making Kakashi suspicious. Very well, the Jounin said as he motioned to his team to turn and leave. Just as he was about to leave he heard the Hokage say something, only he heard it as his team never stopped moving or looked back. What you saw about Naruto, it's S rank secret talk and the punishment will be capital. He said as the Jounin gulped and nodded before walking out of the room. He didn't want to lose his head because he wanted to tell someone that one of his students was an angel in disguise. That alone was frightening. For years he thought that Naruto is just an ordinary kid. Or as ordinary as one can get with a biju sealed inside of you. He had never used the Sharingan on him up until now, since he didn't see a reason why he should. But now he wished that he had used it faster. Maybe if he would have known faster about the boy's status, then it wouldn't be so shocking now, and maybe he would have found out why he was an angel or something like that. As he stepped out of the Hokage tower he saw his team walking in front of him heading towards the marketplace. He picked up the pace and started walking behind them in silence. He looked at his team, a blonde mystery, a pink-haired fangirl and an Avenger that didn't want to show her real gender. He shook his head and then looked at Sasuke and Naruto. He chuckled, just thinking of how it would be if they ended up together. He could still remember when he heard from Itachi what she said about the blonde a year before the massacre. She was young back then and naive, but now, she wasn't like that anymore. He looked at the blonde and frowned. He wondered how long he had been what he is. Not a Jinchuriki, but an angel. He wondered if he had always been one, if Minato's son was actually dead and something else took his place to harbor the Kyuubi and keep it at bay. He shook that train of thoughts away. He didn't want to think that his sensei's son was dead. Even though he had rarely helped Naruto, he didn't want to lose the only connection he had with the yondaime. The Jounin then looked toward Sakura and sighed, she really needed some real training, and she had to realize that the ninja world was not a fantasy world filled with success for ninja. It was a deadly place with heartbreaking events, people died more than they lived. He almost laughed as a thought occurred to him, when Satsuki will reveal herself the girl would be shocked, incredibly shocked just like all the other fangirls in the village. Looking back at Naruto he nodded to himself as he knew that he had to straighten the boy out so he would stop following Sakura blindly. The Jounin's eyes narrowed as he saw the bangs under the blonde's eyes, he didn't notice them until now. He wondered if Naruto slept last night, he also seemed pretty shaken up. The boy in question suddenly raised his head and looked back at Kakashi who just raised an eyebrow. The blonde blinked before looking in front of him once more. Kakashi was amazed, the boy was able to feel him staring at him. Or maybe the boy was just so paranoid that he could feel anyone looking at him. He sighed sadly, the village had made the poor boy so paranoid, and if only they had tried to look underneath, then they would have realized that Naruto wasn't what they portrayed him to be, in fact, he was a great guy when he wanted to be. Kakashi looked up as they found themselves in the marketplace. A few more steps and they arrived at the manhole leading down into the sewers. He sighed, this was not the type of mission he would have wanted to take. However, the Hokage had been in the sewers as well when he banished Orochimaru for his experiments. Kakashi involuntarily shivered thinking of what the snake was doing down in that laboratory. Sakura protested as Naruto moved a lid away and jumped inside without saying anything. I don't want to go in there, it stinks, it has rats, and it's not for a lady like me. She shouted her disapproval as Sasuke rolled his eyes and jumped down. Ila do whatever you say, Sasuke thought. Sakura, your teammates already went, do you want to disappoint them? The Jounin asked as the girl gulped and looked down at the manhole. She shook her head thinking that Sasuke will be disappointed in her, she didn't want that to happen, she had to prove to her love that she can do anything. Without a second thought she started climbing down in the manhole as Kakashi chuckled while looking at her face. A few moments later the Jounin dropped down and an Anbu appeared near the manhole. He grabbed the lid and placed it back in its spot. The people looked at what happened in surprise, wondering what the Uchiha was doing down there. The ninja vanished in a puff of smoke before someone came to ask him anything. Down in the sewers, Team 7 was battling with the foul scent. Sakura felt like puking as the scent moved into her nostrils, this was beyond disgusting for her. Kakashi looked at Sasuke and saw he was shaken as well, he silently chuckled, poor girl. She was trying to keep her facade up and at the same time not to puke. Looking at Naruto he was surprised to see that he wasn't all that affected by the stench. Well, let's go. The blonde said looking back, I really don't want to spend my entire day here. For once, I agree with the dope. Sasuke said as Sakura nodded in agreement, she really wanted to go home now and wash, take a shower, then a long bath, then another shower and then another bath. She also had to send her mother to buy lots and lots of soap and shampoo. Alright, let's go then. Kakashi said as the team started walking slowly on the bricks towards their destination. The last thing they needed now was to fall in that sewer water. It made their stomachs turn only thinking about it. Next time, I will throw the shampoos and soaps in here, that way it will smell nicer. The blonde silently mumbled to himself not wanting anyone to hear. They were still pissed about that minor incident and since they couldn't blame him seeing as he was in the hospital, they were still fuming when thinking about it. It didn't take long and the team reached the Anbu stationed in the sewers. Kakashi was surprised to see the leader there with two teammates. The ninja nodded towards Team 7 as they made several hand seals and the wall near them shimmered. Team 7 was surprised when a hole appeared in the wall. The Anbu walked inside and motioned for them to follow. They did as they were told. Kakashi however was thinking why would the Hokage send his team to retrieve whatever object there is to retrieve if he had already sent the Anbu down here. He could have told them to retrieve that object. Why were they really down here? He stopped thinking as he passed through the hole and looked in wonder at what he was seeing. They were currently in a strange cave, very big. They were like ants inside the cave. His eyes then moved towards a strange temple. From what it seemed, it was located at the end of the cavern. It had a large door which was opened and big stairs leading towards the door in question. Two statues that resembled warriors from ancient times holding pikes could be seen near the door. The statues were facing each other and the pikes were intertwined. Columns sustained the ceiling of the building and there seemed to be no other door. Ghoul, the blonde said with awe in his voice as he gazed upon the massive structure. This was something you don't see every day. This is where we stop. They heard the Anbu say as they took a few steps back. We will wait here. They said as the blonde grinned and started running towards the stairs. Wait, Naruto. Kakashi shouted as he extended his hand towards the blonde who was now walking up the stairs. The boy turned towards the Jounin and grinned. Come on, sensei, old man Hokage said we need to retrieve some item inside. he said as he kept on walking. Soon Sasuke and Sakura started walking towards the stairs. "But what about traps?" he asked. "Ouch." He heard Sakura exclaim as she was lying on her butt rubbing her head and Sasuke was touching the air from what it seemed. Puzzled, Kakashi walked towards his students and touched the air in front of him like Sasuke was doing. He was shocked to feel a wall of some sorts there. He hit the air with his fist and grit his teeth in pain. There was definitely a wall there. It was invisible. But still, how did Naruto pass through the wall? He looked up to tell the blonde to turn back and ask him how he got inside when he heard the doors to the building slam shut. He frantically looked up to see where Naruto was, but the boy was nowhere in sight. His heart skipped a beat as he started calling out his name, fearing for his well-being. But no answer came. The blonde was nowhere in sight. He turned towards the Anbu that had appeared near him in a second. They touched the wall as well. The captain looked at one of his members and told him to report to the Hokage. As the man vanished, he looked back at the wall. "Step back please," he declared as Team 7 took a few steps back. The captain started flashing through hand signs and then touched the wall. A few moments later seals appeared in the air. He looked at the seals and frowned. Not good. Kakashi, who knew a little bit about seals, frowned as well. "You're right." "What's going on, sensei?" Sakura asked with worry evident in her voice. "Is Naruto alright?" "What are those?" "I don't know about Naruto." The Jounin answered truthfully. "All I know is that we can't break these seals, they are too complex, only the Yondaime or the Sannin could break them." "Then how did the dope walk through this wall?" asked Sasuke in anger, though the Jounin could detect worry in her voice. "I didn't know," the Jounin replied as he looked towards the building. "Crap." The blonde said as he was kneeling on the floor, his sword next to him. He was panting and sweating. Just as the door slammed shut behind him, he tried to break it with clones and his sword. But nothing worked. He was stuck inside. "I guess I have to do this on my own," he said to himself as he turned around. In front of him was a long hallway with no left or right turns. He slowly started walking through the hallway. There was no going back. He couldn't open the door by himself, but there might be something at the end of the hallway. He might be able to find another exit. As he kept on walking, he looked left and right at the walls. Numerous drawings were present on the wall. He recognized some of the drawings as they were portraying people, men and women alike, but he did not understand what meaning they had. It showed them fighting against each other, and then it showed them fighting against some strange creatures. He thought he recognized some of the creatures there, but he couldn't be sure. The drawing was very old and in some places it could hardly be recognized as a drawing. The hallway seemed like it would never end. He had lost all interest in looking at the walls a few minutes ago. How long has he been walking for? 15 minutes? 30? Or was he already walking for an hour? He didn't know. It seemed like the hallway would never end. Or so it seemed. Just as he was about to give up and stop walking, he saw a light not far away. He grinned happily as he started running towards the source of the light. A few moments later he entered in a large oval room with many statues holding the ceiling in place, a lot of drawings on the walls and on the ceiling as well. The blonde slowly walked into the middle of the room, walking up 3 steps. He found himself standing on something like a podium, only that it was round and very close to the ground. He scratched his head wondering what he was looking for here. There was no other way to go, just to turn around and go back the way he came. He then heard footsteps coming from behind him. He turned around wondering if his sensei managed to open the door and followed him. However, what he saw shocked him. He took a step back in shock. Behind him stood a monster. Its skin was red, it had 2 large horns on top of its head, the body resembled a human, but it had claw-like feet instead of normal feet, claws instead of hands, and it was holding a large broadsword. The creature snarled at the blonde as it started walking towards him. It was dragging the large sword with it. The sound of its metal resonated throughout the chamber. The blonde was frozen in place. He didn't know what to do. His body was not responding. With each step the creature took, his breathing became more ragged. As the creature was just a few feet away from him, it raised its sword. He knew that the creature was going to kill him. It was going to try and kill him. He had to do something. He had to defend himself. As the creature raised its sword, the blonde reacted. His hand moved to his own sword, and with a swift motion he unsheathed his weapon and parried the enemy's attack. He grit his teeth as he felt the monster giving more power towards the attack, adding pressure. The blonde jumped backwards and moved his body to the side as the monster's large sword crashed on the ground. He then delivered a kick to the creature's chin, making it fall on its back. As the creature dropped on the ground, the blonde jumped on top of it with his sword. He impaled the creature in the chest. The monster roared in pain, but before the blonde could cut the creature in 2, it grabbed him by the throat and slammed him on the ground. The boy gasped in pain as the creature continued to slam him on the cold floor. Gritting his teeth, the boy grabbed the creature's arm and started struggling. He kicked it in the chest, making it lose its grip on him. Naruto jumped away as the creature stumbled backwards. His sword vanished from the creature and reappeared in his hand. He would have been shocked if he wasn't busy with parrying the monster's constant attacks. His eyes glowed white for a second as a light shot from the ceiling, from what it seemed, on the creature, making it howl in pain. Naruto watched as the creature was being burned by white fire. Raising his sword, the blonde dashed towards the creature. He moved his sword back behind him and then plunged it in the creature. The entire weapon went through its skin and the boy found his left hand inside the creature's chest. The monster's eyes unfocused as it dropped on its knees, the sword dropped from its hand. Naruto pulled his hand and weapon out of the creature and took a few steps back in shock. He had just killed, even if it wasn't a human being, he had just killed something. A living creature, despite the fact that it was an abomination, it still was a living creature. His hand started shaking as he heard another set of footsteps. Not wanting to be taken by surprise again, the blonde raised his sword and turned towards the hallway. He was shocked however when he saw who was there. It was an angel. "Excellently done," the angel said in a male voice. He was wearing a white robe with a hood over his head. He had plate armor over the robe and flat shoulder guards. 2 swords were strapped to his waist, 2 white plate gloves and large wings, larger than his. "I assume you are wandering." "I am," the angel said as the blonde nodded dumbly, not trusting his voice. "We have a lot to talk about and you won't like it," the angel said. Hours passed and Team Kakashi was starting to get more and more worried over the blonde boy. The Anbu that left to report to the Hokage hadn't come back and only the captain remained, who looked equally nervous. Kakashi was looking more and more pale with each passing minute. Memories of his old teammate started appearing through his mind. The thought of losing a student on just the first day was starting to plague and kill him on the inside. The captain was doing his best in calming the Jounin and telling him that everything was alright and that the blonde will come out unharmed, but the Jounin was starting to doubt all that. Sasuke and Sakura didn't know what to do in helping their sensei. They were also worried about Naruto, and they were also mad at him for recklessly going in the temple without waiting for them. If only they kept a closer eye on him. After all, Naruto has always been a troublemaker. That wouldn't have changed so soon with him becoming a genin. They were broken out of their thoughts as the doors to the temple suddenly opened. Kakashi's head snapped up so fast that the captain thought he heard his neck break. Not wasting any time, the Jounin jumped on his feet and ran towards the invisible wall, waiting to see if it's Naruto coming out of the temple and if he was unharmed. To his relief, it was the blonde boy. He was slowly walking down the steps with his head down, and the Jounin sighed in relief as he thanked Kami for the boy's well-being. He was about to open his mouth and berate the boy for his stunt when he saw something strange regarding said boy. First was the fact that he was empty-handed. He didn't have the object that the Sandaime wanted retrieved, which was no major problem in Kakashi's mind. The boy's safety was more important than some item. But the second problem was Naruto himself. He could clearly see the boy shaking, fright, anxiety. Or maybe he caught a cold. He didn't know the answer to any of those. "Naruto?" he asked as the boy just passed by him, not even bothering to answer him or stop. Sasuke and Sakura blinked as they saw the blonde move past their sensei and not even stopping to answer him. "Baka. What were you thinking?" Sakura shouted angrily as she stormed over to the blonde and grabbed his hand. She gasped and let go of his hand and then screamed in fright. Her hand was covered in blood. The Jounin and her teammate watched with wide eyes as the blonde's hand dropped next to his body. His hand was all bloody. "Naruto?" Kakashi shouted in fright as he ran to his student to check his condition. "What happened to you?" he asked with fright evident in his voice. The blonde stopped for a second as he turned towards his sensei. "Two need to be alone," he said with a frightened voice, his face pale. Before Kakashi could say anything, the boy continued. "I learned something. You need to understand what my purpose is now," he said as he turned around and started walking away once more. The Jounin stood rooted in place, not understanding what the boy said. He looked at Sakura, who was looking at the blood on her hand with fright. He then looked back towards the blonde, only to see him exit through the hole in the wall and into the sewer. He frowned as he decided he will have to demand some explanations from the Sandaime regarding all of this. It was dark and quiet outside. The stars were sparkling on the clear sky, no clouds could be seen, the moon was fully visible on the night sky, and its light was shining in the blonde boy's room. The boy was currently sitting on his bed, facing the window, with his head down, looking at the ground. He wasn't moving or blinking for that matter. The first sign will be the clear sky and the full moon. The light of the moon moved over the boy as he became tense. His hand moved towards the hilt of his sword, ready to pull it out any moment and cut down anything or anyone that wanted to take him down. He was on full alert, but he was calm on the outside. On the inside, he was scared, he was confused, angry, happy, but those emotions did not surface to the exterior. It's a path paved in blood and horrors. He felt a presence in the house, someone or something was inside. His grip on the sword tightened. If what he had learned was true, then that meant he will no longer have any peace, that indeed he had been cursed furthermore than he already was. But, for them coming so fast, appearing only after the first sign, it wasn't right. But he had told him, they never respect the rules, they always surprise you and always come when you least expect them. Naruto. A voice was heard, he could detect worry in the person's voice, he was still on high alert. He told him, they love to trick the mind. They love to bend reality to their own needs. He could feel the person, or the thing, coming closer towards him. He was ready to lift his weapon and cut whoever was near him in half. He didn't do that however, he felt the person, or thing, sitting down on the bed, not far from him. He could hear him or it sigh sadly. So many emotions he could feel radiating from the person, he was starting to doubt it was his enemy. Naruto, I wanted to talk to you about today. The man said, he could recognize his voice. It was his sensei, Kakashi. He did not answer however, nor did he give a sign that he was aware of his presence. Kakashi knew however that the blonde was listening to him. He looked at the blonde and many questions raced through his head, his meeting with the Hokage had not been what he had hoped for, he didn't receive the answers he was looking for, and he still didn't know what happened to his blonde pupil. So his only option was to talk to Naruto and find out from him what exactly happened in that temple. I want you to know that whatever you did, I'm proud of your choice. Kakashi said as he remembered when the yondaime told him the same thing, it was when he made his first kill, his sensei had not been there to see it and he didn't tell his sensei that he had killed. The yondaime had figured it out by himself and tried to calm him with a few words to let him know that it was alright. But surely Naruto didn't kill anyone in the temple, the sandaime said that there was no way any living being could be there. But then again sandaime had been wrong about some traps. Whatever you did in that temple, whatever choice you made, he said as he took a deep breath, know that I am proud of that choice. He said as he looked towards the blonde who still hadn't moved from his spot. I don't care that you didn't retrieve what we had to, I don't care about that, he told the blonde as he looked out the window. Even if you had to, kami forbid, kill someone in that temple. At this the blonde tensed, it went unnoticed by the jounin who was too lost in his memories and thoughts. I know that you had no other choice, and that you had to do it. This is the life of a ninja, it has its ups and it has its downs, whatever path you chose, I will always be there to help guide you. There is no other path to take, this path has been sealed. Kakashi stood up as he walked towards the window and placed his hands behind his back, he sighed lightly. Someday, you will have to kill a lot of people to save others. Someday, you will have to kill people you thought close to you when they betray you. Someday you will have to kill just so you can survive. The jounin turned around and started walking towards the door. It's the life of a ninja, there is nothing we can do, death will eventually make its way towards everyone, he said with a soft voice. If you ever want to talk to someone, I will listen and I will help as much as I can. He told the blonde as he left, his mind still drifting towards what might have happened in the temple. He didn't know if the blood was Naruto's or no, could only guess. As the jounin left the room, the blonde slowly turned his head towards the door and sighed. If only you knew what I need to do, he thought as he looked towards the window, and a sad smile appeared on his face. At least I know you care. Archangel Chapter 3. Path paved in blood, It was early in the morning when the blonde woke up. Even now, after the talk he had with the angel, he still couldn't catch even a sliver of slumber. It was either the nightmares that didn't let him sleep, the truth of what happened to him, or what those two jutsus stood for. Who would have thought that the demons had this much influence over the world? People were oblivious to what was really going on around them. And they actually thought that the Biju were the worst thing that could happen to them. They didn't even know half of it. The Biju were the least of their problems, or at least they weren't a problem for now. Looking over the cup of ramen, he started thinking of what he could do. Why should it be only him to fight against all those odds? Surely the others could be involved, this was a fight that they needed to partake in. Why only him? There was nothing special about him, he was just an ordinary boy. Or as ordinary as you can be considering the fact that you're a ninja, but he was still a kid. He had no combat experience, he had no knowledge of tactics, and he knew nothing. And from what he was told, he didn't have much time until he had to fight. That thought alone scared him, thinking that he will soon need to go on the battlefield and fend for himself against armies that terrified him. He blinked as he looked down at the cup of ramen, again his mind was playing tricks on him, or something was trying to make him go insane. The cup was filled with the same contents as yesterday. And it made him feel like puking, even though the angel said that they could trick the eyes and mind, they can't trick the senses, and even though the smell of ramen constantly invaded his nostrils, he still couldn't bring himself to pick up his chopsticks and eat it. This was another sign that they were drawing close, but it also raised a question in his mind. What if his tenant was to blame for all this? He didn't know what Kyuubi's role was, the angel didn't say anything about the Biju, not even when he asked. In fact, when he did inquire what the Biju really were, the angel inquired what a Biju was. If the divine powers had no knowledge of the Biju, either the angel lied and this was a test for him to find what the Biju really are, or the angel really didn't know who or what they were. Sighing, the blonde pushed himself away from the table and stood up. He turned around and walked into his room to get ready for the team meeting. His mind was filled with unanswered questions. Questions such as why the jutsu still existed if they proved such a threat, why they let the demons have so much power over the world, and many other questions. The majority was never answered by the angel, and he would probably have to find the answer himself. He didn't really enjoy that. He closed his eyes as his head started hurting. Since this morning he started having headaches. They would come and go, some would be barely noticeable, some would impair his mind so much he felt that it would explode any moment. He began gritting his teeth as he felt that this particular one was going to hurt the most. His head was starting to ache more and more as images began to flash before his eyes. You don't understand. You never want to understand. An angel yelled towards another, rage evident in her voice. The angel yelled and turned towards her and sighed. No, you and the rest are the ones that don't understand. We have to do this, we either kill them now or we curse this land to darkness. He replied as he turned around and started walking towards a strange-looking portal. Naruto's eyes snapped open, he was panting heavily and sweating lightly. What just happened? What did he see? Something from the future, or was it the past? Shaking his head, the blonde slowly stood up and sat down on his bed. He extended his hands and looked at them. Things were getting stranger. First it was the nightmares, now he was starting to see images from throughout time. He closed his eyes and started focusing. He was however curious what happened between the two angels and what the male was referring to when he said that they had to kill someone. A few minutes passed and nothing happened. The blonde sighed as he stood up and walked away from his bed. He would think about what happened later, he had a team meeting to get to. Without wasting any time, the blonde walked out of his house and into the streets of Konoha. His stomach grumbled and he frowned. Hunger wasn't a bad thing, after all he had gone without eating for a week at max when he was little and nothing bad happened. Well, he did faint in the middle of the class and was in the hospital for a month because of that, but it was better than eating worms and insects from a cup of ramen. As he kept on walking through the streets of Konoha, he suddenly realized that he was going the wrong way, the opposite direction of where the training ground was. And what was strange was the fact that even though he knew this, he didn't want to turn around and walk towards the training grounds. It was like something was pulling him in the opposite direction. It was like there was something there that he wanted to see, that he wanted to find. A few minutes later, the blonde realized that he was walking towards the graveyard. He raised an eyebrow, wondering what was pulling him in that direction. As he drew closer to the graveyard, he started feeling a strange aura around the area. It was weak and he couldn't read it like the angel taught him. Another strange thing was the fact that civilians were also walking towards the graveyard. They seemed curious about something. People were chatting amongst themselves. He could catch some of the words like grave robbers and defilers. He knew what those words meant, but he was curious what would people want with the dead. Naruto looked at the large number of civilians in front of him. The graveyard was beyond the mass. He could hear someone shouting from the other side. Whatever pulled him to this place at wanting him to see something or to find out something. He knew this since the feeling he was getting was becoming stronger with each step he took, and the aura around the area would intensify, making it a bit more descriptive. Not wasting any time, the blonde started making his way through the mass by pushing the civilians to the side. Some would look at him with a questioning gaze, while others would sneer in his direction and silently asking what he was doing here. A few moments later, the blonde reached the end of the mass and the entrance to the graveyard. 2 Anbu were stationed at the entrance and the gate was closed. The ninja looked at the blonde in silence. They didn't say anything nor did they move, but he could feel them staring at him. Surely they could see through the genjutsu, therefore they were somewhat stunned of what they were seeing. Naruto looked around, the gates and the walls seemed normal. He looked beyond the gates into the graveyard, but he still couldn't see anything out of place. He looked up at the 2 ninja and slowly approached them. "Excuse me?" he said politely, "can I enter?" Naruto requested. The boy didn't know for sure why he asked that question, instead of asking what happened. He could hear the people around him whispering, but he couldn't understand what they were in the first place. One of the ninja answered after a few moments of silence. "Yes, you can go in," he replied as he opened the gate for the blonde. The civilians looked amazed with what happened. The blonde slowly nodded as he walked inside, the doorway closing behind him. He wasted no time in walking deeper into the graveyard. The 2 ninjas looked at the retreating blonde and then back at each other, while murmuring amongst themselves. "You know, when the Hokage told us about him I thought he had gone senile," the one that let the blonde in whispered to his nodding partner. "Yeah, I know you think he is the one that would judge us. He asked you know when we die." "I don't know, but if it's so, then I feel sorry for those that wronged him," the ninja replied as his partner nodded slowly. Inside the graveyard, the blonde was slowly walking down the path and looking around at each grave and tombstone. Nothing seemed out of place and yet everything seemed out of place. He couldn't describe the feeling he was getting when he entered the graveyard, but it was like someone was calling him or something was calling out for him. It was like there was something here that wanted to be found, but whatever it wasn't good. The feelings he was getting rotten, evil, despicable. As he kept walking he suddenly came to a halt as he felt the aura intensify near him. Looking around he spotted something out of place, the grass around a grave was scorched and said grave was dug up and empty. He walked over to the grave and kneeled in front of it, he didn't actually care about the place, he was more interested in the scorched ground. For a few minutes the boy kept looking at the ground, dark tendrils of smoke would rise from time to time and dissipate in the air. He shivered unconsciously for a second as the voice of the angel echoed throughout his mind. If you find scorched ground, leave the area, they might still be there. You are still too weak to fight them. Don't assume any risks. He slowly stood up, if the angel was right then whatever was here was too powerful for him to beat. He wasn't dumb, he knew that the ninja wouldn't be capable of beating whatever was here, he knew that, somewhere deep down he knew that an entire army of ninja wouldn't be able to defeat whatever was here. Just as he was about to turn and leave he felt a presence behind him, then another and another. His senses were on high alert, slowly moved his hand to the sword's hilt prepared to unsheath it. Naruto. What are you doing here? He heard the familiar voice of the Hokage. He sighed in relief as he turned around to face the Hokage and Tenanbu. He slowly moved his hand away from the sword's hilt, an act which the ninja and the Hokage could clearly see. You startled me, the blonde said as he walked towards the Hokage, for a second I thought you were something else. The ninja looked at each other wondering why the blonde used the term something instead of someone, only the Hokage vaguely knew what the blonde was referring to. He might have expected some type of creature to be here and attack him. So, did you find anything? The Hokage asked as the boy looked back at the seared earth, a fact that everyone noticed. Did you? The blonde started as he looked back at the Hokage, how many graves were dug up? He asked. The old man stood in silence for a few seconds. About 100, he replied, all of them were graves of ninja, all apart from one, and that one held something rather valuable, not to the village and not to the Hokage, but toward someone else. Hokages? The blonde asked seriously, he didn't know why he asked that, but he had a very bad feeling of what might have happened if the dead Hokages were reanimated or their bodies at least. He didn't know if they would still have their techniques, but if they still had them, then it would have been a problem. None, their graves are hidden, the old man replied. Are you sure? The blonde inquired as he looked around, this is very important. The aged shinobi nodded, but that didn't seem to satisfy the blonde, I want to see them, he replied as everyone looked at him like he had grown a second head. No one was allowed to enter to sacred tombs of the Hokages, apart from the current one and a few selected Anbu. I'm afraid that is not possible, Naruto, Sarutobi stated, only classified personnel are allowed to enter their graves. The blonde slowly walked over to the Hokage and motioned for him to come closer. Curious, the Hokage bent forward and listened as the blonde whispered. Gigi, I don't know about you, but I really don't want to fight them later on, he said as the Hokage raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? The Kage whispered back. I'm sure you realize that no one is capable of digging up 100 graves in one night, especially with all the patrols. The blonde stated as the Sandaime closed his eyes and nodded, with all that happened ever since the blonde used the two jutsus some things were just not real anymore. He had to look beyond reality now. Very well, follow me, he said while walking towards the Hokage monument. The blonde nodded and slowly started following the Hokage with the Anbu close behind them. He looked back at the scorched ground one last time and then towards the Hokage monument. He had to risk it, it was better to be safe than sorry. The boy blinked in surprise, who would have thought that the Hokage's graves were underneath the monument. He watched as the old man made several hand signs and then a massive gateway was revealed in front of them. The Anbu moved to the door and grabbed the handles, he watched as they slowly opened the doors for the Hokage and him. The blonde slowly walked towards the open door as a cold breeze hit his face, making him shiver. His eyes narrowed as he started walking down into the tomb as he dubbed it. A few moments later the Hokage followed and just as the Anbu were about to pursue him, the old man ordered them to stay outside and guard, they did as they were told. As they kept walking down the narrow hallway, descending deeper into the mountain, the blonde noticed that the light was starting to diminish. He stopped as he looked behind and saw several torches on the wall illuminating the hallway, he then looked in front of him and saw more of the illuminating objects, only that they were extinguished. He heard the old man, strange, those torches were supposed to be burning, he stated as he started making a few hand signs. As he was done with the seals the old man touched the walls and the torches suddenly lit up. The blonde was surprised a jutsu like that existed if it was a jutsu at least. Then the old man's words rang through his mind, those torches were supposed to have been burning. His eyes narrowed as he moved his hand towards the sword's hilt and started walking down the path once more. The Sandaime noticed the boy moving his hand to the blade, he tensed even though his mind told him that there was nothing wrong with the tomb. The torches would sometimes extinguish and a ninja with the right knowledge would always have to light them up from time to time. After walking for a few more minutes down the path, the blonde felt that aura again. Looking around, he noticed the walls were aired, the ground seared as footprints could be seen in the earth. He tensed as he unsheathed his sword and started moving faster down the path. The Sandaime wasted no time in taking out a kunai from his hidden pouch and following the young blonde. The blonde slowed down as he reached the end of the hallway, stopping in front of a large golden door. He raised his sword and started looking around. The aura was not present here, nor was the ground scorched. He walked to the door and put his hand over it. He tried to open them, but he found out that they were closed. He slightly turned his head towards the Sandaime, who nodded and walked over to the door. The old man bit his finger and smeared blood on the door. A few seconds later they could hear the door unlock and see it open. As the doors opened, the blonde stepped into a large circularly room. The ceiling was sustained by a total of 40 pylons. 10 representing trees and nature, 10 representing water, 10 representing apes and finally, 10 representing frogs and the sun. In the middle of the room stood 4 coffins. Flowers of all kind were present at its base. The coffins were placed on stones slightly raised up. The blonde looked around the room. There was only one way in. He couldn't see any holes in the walls or on the ceiling. He lowered his sword and walked to the coffins. He looked through the glass at the first Hokage. He stood there looking at his face. They are all preserved by a special jutsu, the old man stated as the blonde nodded. It was a bit strange looking at the face of the 40-year-old Kage. He shook his head as he started looking at the rest of the cages, the second and the fourth. Once more he stopped when looking at the fourth. The man who sealed the Kyuubi inside of him, looking at his face he thought he could see himself. Maybe it was the hair, it was the same spiky blonde, but then again it could always be a coincidence. He looked back at the entrance. There was nothing out of place here, but did that mean someone tried to break inside? Looking around, the blonde decided to try a spell the angel taught him. He took a few steps away from the coffins and raised his sword up. He then turned it around so that the edge would face the ground and slammed it in the floor, shocking the old man. But as the blade embedded itself within the earth, the blonde kneeled, an intense beam of light blasting from him towards the ceiling. As the light hit the ceiling, it started expanding in all directions, covering every inch of the room. The Sandaime was fascinated by what he was seeing. On top of that, he could also hear strange voices echo around the blonde, whispers. It was like the wind, and the ghosts were murmuring to the blonde everything that was in the room. He watched as the light expanded in the entire area, covering every inch of the ground and then moving out the door and into the hallway, illuminating it along the way. He was a bit mad when he slammed the weapon in the ground. The floor took a lot of time to make, and maintenance was a pain in the ass. He could hear the words telling him everything that was happening in the room and in the hallway. He could hear them telling him how the torches were burning and how the malevolent aura was still surrounding the same area in the hallway. How the dark shadows of the scorched ground was slowly making its way upwards and then evaporating. The wind blowing in the hallway from the open door where the ninja were stationed. The ninja in question talking about him and the Hokage and other things. A few minutes later, the blonde opened his eyes and the light slowly started to vanish. He sighed as he pulled his sword out of the ground and stood up. He shook his head. There was nothing here. The elements, the spirits, they all said the same. There wasn't anything. Whatever came here, it didn't come all the way down. It stopped midway and then left. Maybe it was on its way down here when they entered the hallway. Maybe whatever was here felt them come and left before they arrived. Find anything? The Sandaime asked as he walked towards the blonde. No, there's nothing here apparently. The young angel said as he sheathed his sword and sighed in relief. At least he didn't have to face the reanimated corpses of the cages later on. Come on, the old man said as he placed his hand on the blonde's shoulder. Let's leave, he said as they both started walking away. After stepping out of the room, the door closed behind them and locked itself. Shadows started appearing in the room as the click of the door was heard. The shadows moved towards the coffins and formed a head, a pair of red eyes watching as the angel and the old man started walking up the path once more. The shadow morphed, making itself a mouth, and then grinned evilly as it slowly sunk in the ground. A low rumble similar to a chuckle could be heard while the shadow sunk in the ground. It was a busy day in Konoha. The villagers were more active than all the other days. People could be seen running like crazy from shop to shop like flies would go from one shit to another. Everyone had their own desire. For the men, a book from the legendary San Jiraiya had been released. For the women, it was a wide assortment of perfumes from Kusa. However, there were those that were out on their daily routines, go there and buy that, go there and sell that and all the other. Naruto could be seen walking through the busy streets of Konoha in deep thought. People had to avoid him so that they wouldn't knock into him because he was so deep in his thoughts that he wasn't even looking where he was going. People around him were already started to follow him for a simple reason. They were placing bets to see when he would hit a pole and how hard he would smash into it. It was a rather interesting sight. Usually the citizens of Konoha didn't want to do anything with a blonde Jinchuriki, but when it came to their entertainment, they didn't really give a fuck about anything. Of course the blonde was completely oblivious to all of this, he was too preoccupied with what happened in the morning. How he felt drawn to the cemetery and the scorched ground. He wondered what kind of demon was that, he wondered where the demon could have disappeared and how powerful it was. Just how great could a grave-robbing demon be? But still, considering the angel's constant warnings, there had to be something about the demon that made him just out of the ordinary. But there was nothing to give him any insight on what he could face, he couldn't compare this one with Kyuubi since he didn't face Kyuubi, and from what he learned in the academy and from the Hokage, the Kyuubi was supposed to be the ultimate baddest demon. Naruto. The blonde heard someone yell, making him stop dead in his tracks. He looked up and saw his pink-haired teammate, she looked very pissed, and behind her were Sasuke and Kakashi. Where the hell have you been? She demanded as she stormed towards the blonde boy who gulped and tried to turn around and run from the demon in front of him. He didn't manage to even turn as she appeared in front of him with amazing speed and grabbed him with both her hands by the neck and started shaking him viciously. "We waited 3 hours for you to arrive." She yelled angrily while shaking the blonde. "Kakashi-sensei arrived in 2 hours and then we had to wait an hour for you before we grew tired and started looking for you." But Sakura-chan, the blonde, tried to explain himself as the girl tightened her hold on him and glared harder. "No buts." She snapped, "I woke up at 6 in the morning to be at the meeting place at 7 and this is what I get." Ma Sakura, maybe Naruto got lost on the road of life," the jounin said with an eye smile as the girl stopped shaking the blonde and slowly turned her head towards the jounin. A deadly look was plastered on her face, making the Sharingan user slightly gulp. He had some deadly encounters with angry women, he didn't need one right now. "Actually, I have a valid reason why I was late," the blonde said, thinking fast. The girl's head snapped in his direction faster than anyone could imagine. The blonde gulped as her eyes pierced fiercely through his skull. "Speak," she demanded. "I was at the cemetery," he said as he gulped, slightly hoping she would believe him. The girl blinked 3 times before letting the blonde go, mouthing an "oh," and then looking away, feeling bad for believing that the blonde had intentionally tried to skip training. "Sorry about that," she said as the blonde grinned and nodded. "It's okay, I guess." "Right," Kakashi said as he closed his book, "now that that's settled, we should head towards the training grounds, we have a lot of catching up to do." "Oh, and don't think you will leave early, we will do overtime today," he told them with an eye smile as Sakura stiffened while turning to glare at the blonde who began to inch away. Sasuke sighed as he looked at the two, they acted so immaturely sometimes, it was mostly Naruto that acted like a kid, but even Sakura had her moments, and it annoyed him. He turned around and started walking back to the training ground with Kakashi in tow. Seeing as the two were leaving, Sakura immediately forgot about the blonde and ran after the object of her affection, leaving Naruto to sigh in relief. He didn't stay back too long as he didn't want to invoke the girl's wrath again. After walking for a few minutes, Naruto realized that they weren't exactly going to the training grounds, he started wondering where they were going. The blonde started looking around, it wasn't long, and he realized that the path they took was leading them towards his favorite ramen stand. Just as he was about to ask why they were going this way, he noticed that they had already arrived at the ramen stand and that his sensei and teammates were entering it. The jounin paused briefly and turned towards the blonde, giving him an eye smile. "Well? Aren't you going to join us?" he asked as the blonde blinked several times before starting to walk to the stand in daze, his mind still asking itself why they wanted to eat ramen all of a sudden. "Naruto. So good to see you again." The chef exclaimed as Naruto entered the stand. He looked around and saw that there was no one else here apart from his teammates who were sitting on the stools, a free spot between them. "Take a seat," Kakashi said as he walked past the blonde and sat down to Sakura's right side. The blonde nodded absent-mindedly and took a seat in between his teammates. "Kakashi-sensei," the blonde said as the jounin turned towards him, "why are we here?" he asked curiously as the jounin smiled and turned to order his food. "Relax and get you to eat, you look like you haven't eaten in days," he said as he placed his order, "besides, after yesterday I thought you might want to loosen up a bit." The blonde nodded again as he turned towards Tucci and ordered his usual dish. As the old man left to prepare their food, he turned towards Kakashi. "Sakura, Sasuke, don't you two have anything to share?" the jounin asked as the blonde raised an eyebrow. He looked at Sasuke, who just nodded and turned his head around, and then towards Sakura, who looked to be deep in thought. He was about to ask what the jounin meant when Sakura decided to speak. "Naruto," she said, "after yesterday, I thought about some things and I'm sorry for the way I treated you all this time." "What do you mean?" the blonde inquired as the girl turned towards him. "What I mean is that whatever you're going through, we're your teammates and you can open up to us. We will listen and help you out, right Sasuke-kun?" she asked as she looked towards the raven-haired boy. "And yes, we can't have you sulking in corners," he stated with indifference in his voice as the blonde grinned. "Well yeah, cause then I would take away your job," he said, chuckling as the Uchiha's narrowed eyes. Look who's talking, the walking kill me sign. Touché, the blonde replied as their food arrived. He looked at the raven-haired boy with the corner of his eye and saw him grinning at his victory. Inwardly the blonde was happy to learn that his teammates would be there to support him if he had problems, but he knew that they wouldn't be able to help him in some regards. He looked down at his food and silently sighed as his mind was playing tricks on him again. He felt the jounin looking at him and decided to ignore his eyes this time and go for his senses like the angel told him. As he took a bite of the contents, he could feel the unmistakable flavor of ramen and smiled. As the blonde was eating, the raven-haired Uchiha slightly turned to look at him. It had been bothering him for some time now. His teammate was acting differently than how he acted in the academy, the way he walked was different and the way he talked was starting to change a bit. He didn't seem to be that outgoing anymore and it didn't seem like he was sleeping anymore, or at least that's what he deducted after the boy showed up with black rims under his eyes, even today. He started thinking back to the academy days. He used to be friends with Naruto before the massacre, but back then it was something different. Now, with the talk they had with Kakashi, he felt like he had done wrong to push the blonde away back then. Alright team, you might have noticed that Naruto isn't here. I don't know where he is, but I do know this, something is wrong with him, and since we are now a team I want you guys to act like one. That was what the jounin said, and when asked what he meant, talk with Naruto, get to know him more, talk with each other, and get to know the other more. I'm sure that you two know little about your blonde teammate, change that because you three will have to trust each other with your life from now on. There was something about Naruto that changed the night before the team placements. He knew that it happened sometime back then, since in the morning he was still the same old idiot. And then the next day, well, he still acted like the blonde idiot everyone knew. The way he walked was different, not to mention the way he acted all of a sudden. Then it happened at the first team meeting, and when they took the test, that sword, it appeared out of nowhere from what he believed. There was no way the boy could hide a weapon under the lake. He turned to look away as the blonde suddenly stopped eating and turned towards him. Somehow the child knew that he was looking at him. Sasuke vowed to find out more about the blonde and he knew just how to do it. The blonde sighed as he stood in the middle of a clearing. The team meeting had been interesting. They stood in the ramen shop for about an hour, eating and chatting small things, getting to know each other. Who knew that Sasuke liked to garden? He chuckled as he remembered the boy's face. It was red as a tomato when he said that. He didn't learn too much about the Uchiha, only the things that he already knew, like the fact that he liked to train, read books about ninjutsu and stuff like that, though the gardening one was something new. Sakura, however, he learned quite a deal things. At one point he was thinking of a way to escape her. That never happened before. Who knew that that girl liked to shop that much? She even started telling them when the right time to shop for things was. He didn't need to know that, nor what colors he was supposed to wear for each month. He sighed, that girl was a maniac when it came to shopping. As for Kakashi, well, he didn't learn anything. He stood quiet all the time, reading his book and sometimes nodding at a question. And when he was asked to talk about himself, he just vanished, just like that. He shook his head as he closed his eyes and took a meditative position. Just like last night he was trying to meditate like the angel told him, clear his mind of all the unnecessary things. From what the being told him, if he were to meditate he would learn more about how to fight and he would learn new spells. That was something rather interesting. Last night when he meditated he learned of a new way to fight with his sword. He didn't quite understand how the whole meditate and you will learn thing was, but as long as he learned how to fight, that was all that he needed to know. As he was meditating a blue aura started appearing around him, a gentle breeze picking up around his form. A very calm look was present on his face. The aura could be barely seen, it would take a highly trained ninja to see it. As he was meditating he suddenly felt a pang in the back of his head, but when he tried to open his eyes, he found himself getting more and more tired, or that he was getting sucked into something. Before he knew it, he had lost consciousness, even though he was still sitting in a meditative position in the clearing. He heard crying, his head snapped up and he looked around frantically. He was sure that it was a woman that he was hearing. Listening carefully he started running towards the sound, towards the crying. It wasn't long, and he reached what looked like a room with a cage at the end. He didn't pay much attention to the cage, all he saw when he entered the room was a girl, sitting on the floor on the far end of the room, crying. Cautiously he walked towards her, the sound of his footsteps echoed in the room as the girl gasped and turned her head towards him. Fear was evident in her eyes and in the way her body was trembling. Naruto was fascinated by her beautiful red hair, her red lips and her angel-like face. She was drawing him towards her just by looking at her. Are you alright?" he asked, trying to use the right tone to make her know that he didn't mean her any harm. The girl began tearing up as she started crying again. "What's wrong?" he asked, and it was then he noticed her features. A red tail and a pair of fox ears were present on her. He blinked in surprise. "I'm a monster," she cried out, "he turned me into a monster." She wailed in despair as she collapsed on the ground. The blonde took sympathy in the girl as he walked closer to her. "Who did this to you?" he asked as he kept walking towards the cage. "The man," she cried, and he said he has no more use for me, he's going to kill me now," she cried as she turned to look at him. "Please, I beg you, save me." She shouted in fright as the blonde's heart started racing. He had to save her. If she was telling the truth, then that man would actually kill her. Not wasting any time, he ran towards the gate with the intent on opening them and saving the girl. "Stop." Someone ordered as the blonde stopped in his tracks a few feet away from the cage. He turned his head around and his eyes rested on an angel. "Do not let him fool you," he said sternly. "What do you mean?" Naruto asked as he turned his head towards the cage. It was then that it happened. It was so fast, he thought he would have a heart attack. The girl just appeared in front of the cage's bars with her right hand extended towards him ready to grab him, her claws ready to tear him to shreds. A sick grin appeared on her face. "So close, if it wasn't for your friend you would have been mine," she said in a deep male voice as 8 more tails appeared behind her and she started changing in a large fox. The blonde looked up in fright. He was standing before the 9-tailed fox, the Kyuubi. He backed away in fear as the fox lowered his head towards him and grinned. "What's the matter?" "Afraid?" The demon laughed softly. "Is the little guardian afraid of the 9th demon?" He continued to laugh, a soft chuckle until it grew into a loud and mocking laughter. "Shut up." The blonde yelled in anger as the fox looked down at him. "Oh, and what will you do?" He grinned devilishly. "I might be stuck behind bars, but I can still control your fears." He shouted as the world around the blonde started changing. In a matter of seconds the entire sewer was replaced with the streets of Konoha. Naruto looked around and saw the entire city burning. He could see the ninja fighting monsters and the undead. They were losing. He could see the civilians running away in fear and getting caught by demons and then ripped to shreds. Then he heard the Kyuubi laugh. His eyes appeared in the large demonic gate, the same gate he had in his nightmares. "Well boy," he heard the demon's voice, "how do you like your nightmare?" He shouted as the ground shook and skeletons rose around him. He moved his hand towards his sword only to realize that it's not there. He looked up in fright as the skeletons started moving towards him. "What will you do?" the beast asked mockingly as the skeletons kept moving towards him. "Will you run like a coward? Or die like a useless martyr?" the fox asked as a man appeared on top of the gate, impaled, like in his nightmares. "Do you recognize the demon?" started as the gate suddenly started inching closer towards the blonde. "Yourself," Kyuubi shouted as the blonde found himself impaled on top of the large gate. He could feel the pain move throughout his body, while feeling the warm damp feeling of his blood run over his skin. "Ah!" the blonde shouted in pain as the demon kept laughing. "You're like the rest." he shouted with glee evident in his voice, "weak, pathetic, and powerless." His laughter continued to echo around him as the boy started trying to pull himself from the pike or stone or whatever was impaled in him. "It's useless." the demon shouted, "Your soul is mine for the taking." He appeared in front of the blonde with his mouth open, ready to devour him. The blonde shouted and felt someone slap him. He opened his eyes and found himself in the clearing from before. He was panting and sweating heavily. "Are you alright?" he heard someone ask, a girl judging by the soft voice. He turned to his left and saw a beautiful girl with hair reaching down to her chest. She was wearing plain civilian clothes. He looked up at her face. Her eyes somewhat reminded him of Sasuke's in color. Her eyes held joy, but he could still see something hidden behind all that joy. "Yeah, I'm fine," the blonde said as the girl blinked at him. "You sure? It's not every day I see someone sitting in the middle of the forest, apparently sleeping or something, and then yelling like a madman or like someone was skinning you alive," she said with a deadpan expression on her face as the blonde chuckled silently. "Yeah, I'm a strange one," he said with a small blush on his face, making the girl giggle. "Yes you are, need help standing up?" she asked, offering him her hand. The blonde smiled and nodded as he took her hand and stood up. "So what were you doing here?" the boy asked with a small smile on his face. "I was walking, like I do every day," she replied. The blonde couldn't trace any hint of lie in her voice. He nodded to himself as he let his guard down. "Walking, eh? Kinda boring," he said with a shrug as the girl shook her head. "It helps, clears your mind, it's refreshing," she said. "You a ninja?" The blonde nodded as the girl smiled. "But why do you wear those bright clothes then?" "I thought you needed to be concealed," she asked, blinking. Naruto frowned a bit. Everyone asked him the same question all the time. "I know, but it was the only thing I could afford," he told her. He didn't know why exactly, but he felt relaxed near the girl and he felt like he could talk to her and trust her. Just as he was about to ask her something, the girl looked up at the sky and frowned. "I'd better get going, it's getting late," she said as she turned around and started running away. The blonde nodded absent-mindedly when he remembered that he didn't ask her for her name. "Hey!" the blonde shouted, trying to get her attention. "What's your name?" he asked, but it seemed like she didn't hear as she kept on running until she vanished behind some trees. The blonde sighed as he looked around, he brought his hand up to his face and looked at it. The meeting with Kyuubi was not what he had expected, even though the fox was behind the seal it could somehow control his mind or something like that. He wasn't sure what the being had done to him, but everything he had experienced was so real. He took a deep breath to calm down and then looked around, it was better if he went home to try and get some rest. As the blonde started walking away, Sasuke jumped down from the tree he was hiding, he looked at the retreating blonde, wondering if he should follow him or not. He decided however that it would be best not to follow him, after what he had witnessed something clearly was wrong with him. What exactly he didn't know, but he was sure he would find out what. He turned around and started making his way home, it would be bad if someone saw him here. It's happening. A voice echoed in the Sandame's office, the old man looked up from his papers and towards the origin of the sound. The angel that had visited him just 2 days ago was there. They are here? The old man asked, his voice filled with anxiousness and a bit of fear. He did feel a bit of fear, he would fight the unknown, or his worst nightmares, anyone would be afraid. No, not here. The angel replied as he looked out the window, the old man sighed in relief, he wasn't ready to go to battle, even though he had made a promise to protect Naruto until he was ready, they're somewhere out there, I felt it when a portal opened. The day the Sandame started as the angel turned towards him and cut him off. I know the graves, the boy risked a lot going down there, especially when I told him to turn and run if he came across certain signs, the angel said with a bit of anger in his voice. The scorched ground, I presume? Sarutobi stated as the angel nodded and turned to look out the window once more. What exactly? The Hokage started only for the door to be opened by his secretary. He looked at the woman and then towards the angel, or at least the spot where he should have been. Hokage-sama, pardon the interruption, but Hyuga Hiashi is here to speak with you. She said as the old man turned towards her and nodded, letting her know that she could send the man in. The secretary took a few steps back and seemed to talk to someone, she then opened the door and the Hyuga head stepped in. He bowed respectfully to the Hokage who nodded and told him to take a seat in front of him. The man wasted no time in walking to the chair in front of the Hokage's desk. So, what brings you here, Hiashi? The Sandame asked with a smile. The man kept a passive face as he started talking. I would like to talk about Uzumaki Naruto. He said as the Hokage raised an eyebrow, wondering why Hiashi wanted to speak about the boy, usually he only spoke about him if said boy had done something wrong or when he was subject to one of his pranks them. He hoped it wasn't related to some kind of prank. What do you wish to talk about? The Sandame asked as he leaned in his chair and brought his hands up under his chin. Well, the boy has been acting strange for the past days, it seems like he's planning something, he said seriously. To Sarutobi it seemed like the man was suspecting Naruto of doing something big and very soon. And that would be? He asked. Well, for starters, this morning I saw him enter the graveyard and then walk around some graves that were dug up. It makes me wonder what he was doing there, Hiashi replied as the Sandame nodded. It was obvious that someone from a clan might see him. It was good that it was Hiashi and not someone from the council or the advisors. Who knows what might have happened then? The Sandame was about to reply when he felt something strange, he didn't know why he didn't realize it until now, but he couldn't feel Hiashi's chakra. Either the man was masking it or he wasn't Hiashi. But then again, there wasn't a civilian that could use a hinge or something. Lord Hokage? The Hyuga inquired, is there something wrong? Sarutobi shook his head. No, I was just wondering why you were masking your chakra, he said as he looked up at the man and saw the puzzled look on his face. Chakra? He asked, and just as the Hokage was about to ask another question, the angel appeared in the room behind Hiashi with a pole arm in his hand. The angel stabbed the Hyuga through the chair with his weapon and lifted him up towards the ceiling. What are you doing? The Hokage shouted as he jumped up on his feet. The angel slammed the Hyuga on the ground and pulled his pole arm out of the body and then cut Hiashi in half with it. The door then burst open and 2 ninja and the secretary rushed in. The angel turned towards them and raised his hand as all 3 of them suddenly collapsed on the ground. What is the meaning of this? Sarutobi shouted in anger as he looked towards the angel who turned towards him. The 3 are just unconscious, had to erase their memory about me, he then looked down at the Hyuga's corpse. This one had to die, he said as the Hokage grit his teeth in anger. Watch, the angel said, pointing towards the dead body. The old man looked down and before his eyes the Hyuga's body started changing until all that was left lying on the floor was a black thing. It was tall as an adult man, but its entire body was pitch black. It had tentacles instead of arms or hands, its face looked like a mixture between a squid and a human, the only thing that looked human was its body and legs. This is a shadow, a demon serving under the second general of hell, the angel said as he impaled the body with his pole arm, weak alone, almost impossible to kill when in a group of his resurrections. What resurrections? Where is Hiashi? What the Sandame couldn't believe what he was seeing in front of him, the dead body of a demon that posed as Hiashi, the head of the Hyuga clan. Shadows cannot be seen by humans as long as they are alive. If a shadow walks into your shadow, then it can assume your form, shape-shift. However, it's vulnerable when shape-shifted. Easy pickings if you can find them. As for resurrections, you just found your grave robber. Sarutobi's eyes widened as he looked towards the angel, who continued to speak. Shadows are mostly used as recons and body retrievers. Usually they have a master with them all the time. I can't sense its master, so it must have been sent here on a covert mission, the angel said as his hand blazed in a display of scorching flames. He threw a large white fireball towards the corpse, incinerating it in a few seconds and leaving only the pole arm that was stuck in the ground and some ashes. Its master is a necromancer, brings the dead back to life, but only the body. They can't manipulate the soul. The shadow retrieves the bodies that the necromancer desires. Since it's so hard to spot, it's the best options that they have, the angel stated as he picked his pole arm up and turned towards the Hokage. My friend, war is about to begin, he said with a serious voice as his wings started blazing with a white flame, but this time you will not lose to them. He said as he vanished in a spiral of roaring fire. What if Neglected Naruto breaks female Sasuke council bashing, and thanks for watching my video till the end. If you enjoy this content, then do consider subscribing to my channel and leave a like if you guys need the next part, comment down, and thanks for watching the video and see you guys in the next video.